This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Everybody hear it okay? Can you hear all right? In the back? All right, excellent. How many have never heard me present before, either on radio or personally? Wow. That is pretty unusual these days, I gotta say. Let me give a little bit of background in terms of what got me involved in these issues and some of the things that we've done in the last 10 or 12 years that are sort of related to what we're doing today. By way of background, I'm from Alaska. That's where I work. I've spent most of my life. I'm married. I have 5 children. My wife Sheila is with me in the back. Wave your hand. She's in the very far back. So say hello to Sheila when you get a chance. In between us, we have 5 children. My youngest is just turned 12. My oldest is just turning 28. So we have a pretty good range. We're both 47. We age fairly well. The advantage of being in Alaska in the dark during the winter. I had worked in Alaska, and my family had been involved in Alaskan politics most of my life. My father was in the United States Congress, the 92nd Congress. He was in the state Senate a number of years. My brother Mark is mayor of Anchorage presently. Family are pretty much Democrats. I've been involved in both teachers' movements in Alaska. I was the president of the Alaska Federation of Teachers for a couple of terms, the Anchorage Council of Education for a couple of terms in Anchorage. And about the last 11 years, most of my work has been dedicated to reporting and writing on technology-related issues. Although I've done some consulting the last 6 years for Chickalin Village, which is a federally recognized Native American tribe in Alaska. And I've also recently accepted an appointment as executive director for the Lay Foundation on Technologies, which is based in Dallas, whose mission is to educate the public on technology issues and their impact on humanity. And so on the basis of all of that, I'd been working independently in the sciences and had read an article a number of years ago about a project called HAARP. How many have not heard about that in the room? Okay, there's not so many hands going up, which is a good thing. HAARP was the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project. It was based in Alaska, is based in Alaska. It was run at that time by the Air Force and Navy. And it's essentially a large array of radio frequency antennas that are designed for a number of weapons applications. I'm going to talk a little bit about that because that really is going to lead into the subjects that we want to cover tonight. The idea of physical control of the mind, a lot of people are sort of stunned by that and say, is that really real? Is there really issues out there in terms of controlling the human mind? This is a cover from the May 25th, 2002 issue of The Economist. And the cover story is The Future of Mind Control. And what this cover story was about is the ethics of utilizing this technology for various means, whether they're for improving or enhancing human performance or using it in military applications. And I want to talk a lot about military applications and the misuses of technology because, quite frankly, we're actually the best and the worst at it, depending on where you stand in terms of doing that kind of thing. HAARP, what struck me about HAARP when I first read the first articles about HAARP, they were in foreign journals. They weren't in the US press. And it was on a project taking place in Alaska. And Alaska, as everyone knows, is a big geographic region, but a very small population. We have less than 700,000 people in Alaska. As a consequence, issues that come up are generally, there's 1,000 people in the whole state that deal with the politics of the state as activists, I would say is probably a fair number. So when things come up, you kind of are plugged in, you know what's going on if it's in your own backyard particularly. And here was a project taking place in Alaska that was getting virtually no local coverage, no interest by the local environmental community, except for the area that they were going to disturb for wetlands that they were going to disturb and some migratory pathways of migratory birds, which kind of surprised me because when I read the article, the first article in a foreign journal, the claims about this project were pretty extreme. I mean, I didn't believe it, quite frankly. I just didn't believe the assertions on what these people were saying this project could do. And unlike a lot of folks, I don't just discount that kind of thing. I go to the library if it's interestingly enough and look up those sources and see whether or not they're valid, and then do my own work from there. Well, with HAARP, it was kind of my good friend called it the tar baby because I couldn't let it go. You know, I kept finding more information on this project, and here's basically what it is. It's an array, a field of antenna. The original array was 48. They've just expanded it to 180 antennas. These are approximately 72 feet tall. And then they have a cross dipole that runs about 60 feet in either direction. So it's a big field of radio frequency antennas. And what they do with these is by firing them in very specific ways, you can create a number of different effects. And one of the primary objectives was to focus radio frequency energy into an area above the Earth's surface called the ionosphere, which begins about 30 miles above the Earth's surface. And radio frequency energy, when you think about it, if you ever think about it at all, when it's coming off of a radio antenna like what's broadcasting radio stations in this area, that energy comes off the antenna and very quickly dissipates, spreads out very rapidly, which is why the further you get away from the transmitter, the weaker and the weaker the signal, because that concentration becomes less and less dense over distance. With this array, the objective was to focus that radio frequency energy. By firing those antennae in a very specific way, they could create what's called cyclotron resonance, where the energy actually focuses into a relatively small area, where then they can utilize that energy for stimulating or manipulating the ionosphere, almost like connecting the ionosphere to the machine on the ground to get it to react to this signal. Now, what would they use this for? The things that the military came out with that were in the open literature, the first things were communications. The ionosphere is critical for communications, which is why when you have high solar activity and it disturbs the ionosphere, that radio stations and all kinds of communications can get disrupted when you have this energy interaction. So the idea was to learn first about the ionosphere, to see if they could manipulate it in ways that would stabilize it during those periods to facilitate communications for our military and others. Or at the same time, being able to disrupt the ionosphere in such a way where you can carry your own communication signals but disrupt all of your adversaries. And from a military perspective, I think we can all kind of see, you know, the advantages and disadvantages of that from a military's point of view. The other things that came out was the idea that if you pulsed energy, if you sent the high frequency energy coming off of this array and you sort of punch the ionosphere with pulses of that high frequency energy, the ionosphere begins to then pulse in harmony with that pulse rate. So it changes its character from DC to essentially AC, alternating current, acts as a giant broadcast antenna in the sky, sending back to the Earth a signal within the ELF range, extremely low frequency range. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as we go on. So if I'm losing a few people, don't be uncomfortable. We'll gather all of this up and it'll all make sense as we go along. ELF, for communication with submarines at depth, you need a very long wavelength to get through the Earth and sea because short wavelengths won't do it. So you remember back a number of years ago, the big controversies in Wisconsin, Michigan, where they were burying these 14 to 26 mile long antennas under the ground at the ELF project for creating these low frequency signals for communications with submarines. The idea here is if you could make that virtual antenna in the sky and instead of 14 to 26 miles long, you could affect perhaps a 1,000-mile area of the ionosphere, you could in fact send this ELF signal through the Earth and sea for communication with subs, but you could also utilize it for another application that showed up in the military literature called Earth penetrating tomography. In plain language, by analogy, it would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep for underground facilities, underground structures. That was actually proven up in 1996. There was a sort of a footnote on the budget bills going through the Congress, and for HAARP was funded in '96 under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of nuclear weapons for this particular application. And they said, you get no more money until you prove up Earth-penetrating tomography as a concept. And so a guy named Papadopoulos led that charge at the University of Maryland. He was actually interviewed on a program called Horizons, which runs on BBC. It's similar to our Discovery type of shows, Discovery Channel kind of shows. But in that interview, they actually had tested this, and with 99% accuracy, statistically about as accurate as you can get, they mapped, using Earth-penetrating tomography from HAARP facilities, the actual ground strata surrounding some mines that had been operated, underground mines, a number of years before, where they could actually distinguish where all of those channels and pathways were. So earth penetrating tomography became important right after 9/11. MSNBC on November 27th of 2001 ran a story. You can look it up on their website, where they actually suggested that HAARP be used, earth penetrating tomography applications of HAARP be used in Afghanistan for locating underground facilities there. So it starts to show up a little bit in the mainstream from time to time. You'll see references to that. The earth penetrating tomography was interesting also because ELF signals, extremely low frequency signals, happen to be a lot of what goes on within the human brain in terms of predominant brainwave activity. And let me give you kind of a little short synopsis of that. And these are approximations, but approximately from, say, 1 to 4 hertz. And hertz, when I'm saying hertz, think about it as pulses per second, vibrations per second, whatever you're more comfortable with if you're not technically oriented. But what happens in the 1 to 4 hertz range is where we are in our deepest states of sleep, our delta states. And this is where we're just profoundly asleep. It's a meditative state can get there by practitioners with maybe 20 years experience for very brief periods of time. It's a tough state to get to. The next level is theta, which is approximately 4 to 7 hertz. This is where 3 to 5-year-old children spend most of their time. It's where you are as an adult between the waking and sleeping state, where you're sort of actively aware of your dreams, but you're still asleep, that kind of state, which kind of explains 3 to 5-year-olds fairly well, distinguishing from imaginary and the real, because there's really a blur there. This is their normal state. We do some pretty bad things there because we try and move them a little bit faster developmentally into states that are more analytical. You start moving into the alpha range, 7 to approximately 11, 12 hertz. This is where you are when you're in the zone or in that ideal state of learning. Creative work takes place there. A little bit higher than that, the beta ranges, the lower beta ranges is where hopefully everyone here is, unless I've put someone to sleep. And then the high beta is where you are when you're agitated. So these are all operating in this well below 100 hertz, and most of the activity in the 1 to, say, 20 hertz range. And these are for predominant brainwave activity of a human being. And what we know about that is external oscillators of various kinds can actually entrain the brain, cause the brain to lock onto those external signals, where it begins to mirror that external signal in a way that changes brain chemistry and behavior. And this is extremely important as we go through the day and talk about how that applies. And I'm going to show some things after the break. And kind of the way I want to do this is the first part of this, I want to sort of lay out the military applications. And the second part after the break, we'll show a short video that kind of encapsulates a lot of what I'm saying. And then we'll talk about sort of the positive things that are happening in this area as well. But to go back to HAARP again, because this is where this issue started to come up for me, is what got me interested in HAARP is I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. My area of interest was electrophysiology, the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human body. And so when I looked at this huge transmitter that eventually will have an effective radiated power of 1 billion watts, now this isn't input power, this is effective radiated power that's based on a computation for what that antenna gain and what happens within the antenna array itself, but we're talking about a very, very large amount of energy, the largest transmitter of its type ever built. Now back in the 70s, there was a number of these transmitters in the former Soviet Union. They used to refer to them as ionospheric heaters. They were associated with a number of phenomena. In fact, some in this very area were reported back in the 70s that were supposed to be creating some negative health effects and so on from these transmitters in the former Soviet Union. The thing that came out is those transmitters, to change a frequency, required almost 15 minutes to reset the devices because they're old technology. What you have with HAARP is, first of all, a much more powerful system, one that you can actually move and adjust frequency fairly rapidly in milliseconds. And the other thing that you can do is affect either directly or indirectly what's called 16 decades of frequency, which runs everything from extremely low or ultra low frequency all the way up to visible light. You can stimulate a number of different effects. This year, they're quadrupling the site. It's been operating with 48 antenna. This year, they just finished installing 180. So this fall, which is when their next campaigns will begin in November, we'll see what all happens with that. The other applications of HAARP that came out that struck me was the idea of heating the ionosphere. Now, visually, if you could see what was going on above this array, you would get an area about 30 miles in diameter. By heating it, you can actually lift the ionosphere up, push the ionosphere out a couple hundred kilometers, where lower atmosphere then moves in to fill that space. And what happens as a anti-satellite technology, low orbiting satellites encounter that atmosphere that's not supposed to be there, they burn up, you switch the device off, everything goes back to normal, satellite is malfunctioned and dead, and you've got plausible deniability because nothing ever left the ground unless you were observing the energy exchanges that were taking place at the time. The other place where that application comes up, interestingly enough, was from the Strategic Institute in London, was referencing some Russian research where they believe this would be quite useful for just anti-satellite technology, but incoming space debris or comets, asteroids, those kinds of things, where normally you get maybe that 30 miles of atmosphere to start burning objects up. What if you could get 210 miles of atmosphere to burn things up? You could get rid of a lot larger objects, that kind of an application. But when I started looking at it, I'm thinking, you know, what else happens when you start moving atmosphere around? What happens if you're in the proximity of a jet stream and you alter its course? You know, some pretty dramatic things can happen. And a good example of that was in Scientific America. There was an issue, I think it was May 2002. It might have been 2001, but the whole issue was dedicated to weather in Scientific America. And midway through it, there's a map of Alaska. Coincidentally, right above the HAARP facility, it shows the jet stream kind of flowing along. And then it takes this detour 50 miles north, and then it goes east about 50 to 75 miles and drops back south and then sort of follows its course. And what that particular change did is move weather fronts downline on that jet stream from East Texas into Central Florida and dropped a couple tornadoes in Orlando a few years ago. Do you remember that big event? And that was just a slight change in the jet stream very, very far away. That application, the idea of it affecting environmental systems became very disturbing to me as a researcher. And then looking at the ELF applications and understanding that the amount of energy involved, according to the program manager, was going to be at approximately the same level as the Earth naturally produces in the radio frequency range, which is very small. I mean, if you think about radio frequency energy surrounding us, and there's lots of energy surrounding us. A good friend of mine that we visit with here, Rick Miller, said it's the soup. And I call it the sewer because it's worse than the soup. Around us is 200 million times approximately more radio frequency energy now than the Earth naturally produces, or what was produced around say a little over 100 years ago. So we've added, you know, all of this. Now, out of all of that, 200 million times more energy. What was found in the radio frequency regime, a guy named Jose Delgado. How many have heard of Jose Delgado? Okay, there's a few. He was at Yale University. He started with, he came over from the University of Madrid. He had gotten his degree in electrophysiology in 1950. How many even know such a degree would exist today, much less in 1950? He came over and he went to work at Yale, and the main mission there was to map the brain. And so they used primates and animals of various kinds and humans, and mapping the various portions of the brain responsible for various function, and then implanting various portions of the brain to stimulate activity to see what would happen. And one of the big famous images of Delgado actually showed up in a book that he wrote called Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society, because his view was that this technology should be applied, behavior modification technology should be applied to improve the various emotional condition of humanity, which I strongly disagree with. I think that's something we individually can decide as time goes on. But Delgado, in 1969, he actually shows a charging bull in this book, and it's gotten a lot of notoriety. His charging bull is coming at him, and he flips a switch on a radio transmitter, and the bull stops right before it hits him. Doesn't stop dead, it just stops. And in this case, he was using an implanted technology to stimulate the various portions of the brain. And this is in the 60s. By the mid-80s, he had figured out that using a very specific window frequency and using radio frequency energy at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces. So 1 billion times less than what man produces or more. He was able to change the behavior of primates like flipping on a light switch from aggressive to passive, just by targeting within a very narrow band those animals with very, very little energy. It's not the amount of energy that's relevant, it's the way in which the energy is manipulated. We were testifying on the subject of HAARP in the European Parliament it was February 5th, 1998. We were in the Security and Disarmament Committee, and they brought us over to talk about HAARP. And the other thing that we did in that committee is we made this jump into physical control of the mind and technology related to it, and we demonstrated some things in that hearing. It resulted in a resolution passing that included a section, and I want to read that section as it applies to today's presentation. It was their resolution A4005/99, and this is probably the most, in fact it was, the most comprehensive resolution on environment, security, and disarmament that the European Parliament had ever passed. And this is 3 sections on HAARP, and the last section, which is extremely important, and I'll quote it, it says, it calls for an international convention introducing a global ban on all developments and deployments of weapons which might enable any form of manipulation of human beings, unquote. Now, I mentioned in my intro, I come from a political family, and I can tell you that taking on the issue of controlling the mind as a political issue is not something politicians are enamored and excited about jumping into. All right, because the amount of ridicule that potentially you're subject to means you've got to present some pretty strong evidence to compel them to take the issue on in the first place. We had traveled to Europe in the last 11 years, 12 times. 4 of those times were sponsored by people affiliated with governments within Europe, the European Parliament, a group called GLOBE, which is 44 governments, top 200 environmental legislators in the world. To belong, you've got to be a federally elected or nationally elected legislator. They brought us in to talk about these subjects, and within the European Parliament hearing, we were supposed to have 15 minutes, and they do it a lot differently there. You know, public hearings here, everybody gets to come, sign up, say what you want. It doesn't happen that way in Europe. You're invited, you get your presentation done, and that's it. And so what they did is they tried to get NATO to debate us on the merits of these technologies in the European Parliament. The head of that committee was a guy named Tom Spencer. He ran the Oversight Committee for the Security and Disarmament Committee. It was Foreign Affairs, most powerful committee in the European Parliament. Tom was a conservative, and I said to some people before we started that, you know, the majority of our support in the first 5 years came from conservatives. And it was because of the impact and the potential impact on civil liberties and personal freedom that some of these technologies really deliver. And there's some real good crossovers, because too often we separate ourselves politically in this country when really the underlying themes should be uniting us. And that's something that's long overdue, and something that I believe is, on these kinds of issues, is happening and will continue to happen. What happened in European Parliament is we remembered just a few months before there had been a big news story about 700 kids in Japan going to the hospital, epileptic seizures after watching a cartoon. How many remember that bit of press? What it was, you know, these kids were all sitting back, you know, 10, 15 feet away from the television, supposedly all safe, right? Because the energy, you put your hand up next to that TV and you feel the static discharge, and the further you get away, you know, the energy dissipates. You're supposed to be safe and wonderful, right? And if you measure that energy, that light energy emitted from that television set at 10 or 15 feet, you're not going to see much of anything. What happened is, for a segment of that cartoon, they maintained a flicker rate, a light flicker rate that hit one of those window frequencies that triggered those seizures in those kids. It was non-ionizing radiation. It was supposed to be harmless. Using that example in the European Parliament was timely and useful in the sense that it refuted a lot of what had been said by others when they were getting ready for this hearing. NATO refused to debate us for 2 reasons. One, they said they had no policy on ionospheric modification for weapons application, the stuff of HAARP, and they had no interest, and they had no policy on the use of non-lethal weapons. And the hearing officer that was running it was pretty upset. In fact, she put together a 5-hour meeting the night before with myself, someone from the International Red Cross, and 2 people from the European media to go through what we were going to detail in the hearing so that they would be prepared to ask questions. And 15 minutes the next day turned into an hour and a half where we were given the opportunity to really present in depth. NATO was in the room, they were in the back. They weren't participating actively in the hearing. But what we opened the hearing with was a document called Ionospheric Modification for Weapons Application, produced by NATO France. And that kind of ended their story about not having any interest in that subject. And then the other thing we opened with was the Strategic Studies Institute in London's analysis of the use of non-lethal weapons through NATO Europe without policy guideline. And so by August, this was February, by August they had policy in place for non-lethal weapons use, which is kind of nice to see happen. But on the HARP issues, they steered clear of it. And they just wouldn't back off of it. And what we said in that hearing was that this was the beginning of the U.S.'s effort to abrogate the ABM treaty. This was a year before it was publicly stated that that was going to happen. We said this is what our research says in the open literature. They're going to end it, and they're going to use the argument there is no Soviet Union, therefore there is no treaty. And 9 months later, that is exactly what the senior senator from Alaska, Ted Stevens, said on the floor of the Senate as they began that move with the cooperation of the Democrats to wipe out that treaty. And for us, it really solidified a coalition that we'd built in the European Parliament that started with conservatives, that then went to Greens and Social Democrats. And we had probably one of the most ironclad coalitions on those issues that we were concerned about that you can get in Europe. That's what you need to get legislation passed. As a result of that, we were invited to a couple of other forums. One of them was attended by 12 members of the Russian Duma, or their legislature, and they became very interested in this issue. By 2002, they had passed resolutions opposing HARP and had forwarded them on to the United Nations based on our evidence and testimony, and confirmation of that from 97 and 98 when we were testifying in front of those groups in Brussels. By 2002, Russian scientists had come forward and had affirmed the fact that not just the environmental implications of the system were real, but the physiological implications of being able to affect human behavior over large geographic areas was also real. Now, when you go back, you can go back to a writing, Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book called Between Two Ages. Now, that's before he was National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, when Jimmy Carter was president. When he was still at Columbia University, he wrote this book, and it was an analysis. I'm sure you've got to have it in your library because it sold a lot of copies, a couple 100,000 copies. You've got to have one here somewhere. But it was 1971, 1972, it seems to me that it was actually written, I believe published in 73. And when you read it today, it's sort of the impact of technology on politics, culture, economies around the world. And it's like, if you read it today, you'd swear it was a history rather than a forecast, because it is dead on accurate about what happened on the socio-political scene across the world in terms of how governments in Eastern Europe collapsed. That was all predicted there. The changes in Africa, Latin America were all predicted there. The things were happening within the United States. But one thing that he said within the text of this, and it was all about technology being used to further political agendas. And he said that the idea of being able to manipulate human behavior was becoming a technology that in the early 70s was pretty desirable. And he felt that it would eventually result in big changes. One of the things he quoted was a quote from J.F. Gordon MacDonald, who was a geophysicist at UCLA. He had written a chapter in a book called Unless Peace Comes, and the chapter was called How to Wreck Your Environment. This is before Earth Day for the younger people in the group. When people could get away with writing a chapter like that, no one would even blink. And what he said there was that if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would change the behavior of people over large geographic areas. And in 1969, 1970, 71, 72, 73, when all this was being discussed, they didn't have such a system until they developed HARP, which this is where the connection for me registered, and I'm thinking, okay, now you've got a device that will generate an ELF within the range that's necessary, within those window frequencies, that is big enough to generate a signal that will cover a hemisphere if you wanted to. And you would affect the behavior of large percentage of the population. Now, when you look at sort of the literature on this, radio frequency energy as a tool for manipulating human behavior, that goes back to Delgado's work at Yale, where it substantiates that. There was also some work done at the University of Utah when they produced the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, and that was done for the Air Force Science Advisory Board. And it was the idea of looking at radio frequency energy and its effect on not just the brain, but every vital organ of the body. And what they found is that they could manipulate radio frequency energy in a way that would overrun the heart, the liver, the lungs, or any other organ so that it would malfunction or not function properly. Now, how many remember seeing that new device that they keep saying is a new device? They've been saying it every year for 5 years. I think we wrote about it in 1999, and the last press release announcing this great new technology about 6 months ago. And it's the Humvee with the dish mounted on it for creating heat sensations on the surface of the skin for riot control purposes. How many have seen sort of references to that? Okay, a few. What this is, it's a radio frequency device. When you introduce a new device to the battlefield, you got to tell people what it is, because you're going to go use it. What they didn't tell you is, it'll create heating sensation where you actually feel like you're being burned by 130-degree temperatures on the surface of the skin for riot control. Now that's if you range it properly, unless you happen to range it for a mile and walk 10 feet in front of it. It's just a little bit of a quick fry, because you're getting a lot more intensity and a lot more energy. Now, the last time burning was sort of a behavior modification tool was about 500 years ago when we were burning people at the stake, and we decided that was a bad idea. This is the modern version of that same concept. It's really no different. I mean, the idea of introducing this technology, there's a protocol that was signed off by Department of Defense and Department of Justice, where what are called non-lethal weapons, where this falls into, are given priority funding when they have dual use, when they can be used against civilian populations as well as declared adversaries. This is a very important concept. Most of the international treaties, the chemical and biological treaties that were signed off a few years ago, they have an exemption within them, domestic use. That's how in Moscow, when the Chechens took over the movie theater, the gas they used was illegal to use against a declared enemy outside the boundaries of their country, yet they could use it against their own population and meet the requirements of that treaty. Almost every one of our treaties have those exemptions for domestic use. When you look at the treaties on environmental manipulation signed by us in 1977, most people don't even realize such a treaty exists, where we agreed not to create things like modification of weather or earthquakes or volcanic eruptions or these kinds of activities as weapons of war. We, along with 60 other countries in 1977 and before, that's happened to be when we ratified that treaty, said we weren't going to do it. People say, well, is that technology really available? There's a quote, this is from the Department of Defense, William Cohen, from April 28, 1997, and the conference was it was called a Conference on Terrorism and Weapons of Mass Destruction and U.S. Strategy. Now, this is quite a bit before 9/11, and this is what he said. Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves, unquote, by a seated Secretary of Defense. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement. When you talk about these technologies, you think about military technology, everybody thinks about bombs and bullets and precision-guided weapon systems. The shift in what the military today calls an RMA, a revolution in military affairs, and you'll hear that if you listen for it. Listen to when they bring up this revolution in military affair, this RMA, and it's about energy as the medium for new weapons applications as opposed to the traditional bullets and bombs. Whether you're using what are called non-lethal weapons, which the U.S. definition recently changed, but was for quite a long time, if it's non-lethal if it kills less than 25% of the time. Like a Claiborne landmine, which would fit into that category, because it doesn't kill more than 25% of the time. It usually just takes off legs and limbs and those kinds of things. But that kind of a ridiculous definition for a non-lethal weapon. Now, non-lethal, when you think of gas, in the United States, over 100 people have died from asphyxiation because of lung disorders, asthma, and related disorders. Non-lethal does not mean non-lethal. It just means that the person holding that weapon is more willing to use it with the belief that they're not going to hurt anybody. Because you can go to Yugoslavia when we were in there for over a year with live weapons, and for a year we didn't shoot anybody, because we all knew when you pull the trigger, someone dies. A non-lethal weapon like in Northern Ireland, where they use non-lethals, people die of rubber bullets, they die of gas, they die of a lot of things, but you don't really hear much about it. Sticky foam, another one that people die from, and they well, how do you die from sticky foam? Well, get it on your face and see what happens. It might stop you, but asphyxiation is not a good way to go. So non-lethal weapons, when you hear that ploy, take another step, and that's where you start to look at the use of energy itself to deal with manipulating human physiology. There's a document that's called Low Intensity Conflict in Modern Technology. It was produced by Maxwell Air Force Base in 1984. And if you can find a copy of that, get it. And it's extremely good material, because it lays out sort of the two sides. On the one hand, it's sort of the beginning of where they say we need an analysis of all of these various forms of energy that we could use in weapons applications and target individuals. And so that's where you get the radio frequency dosimetry handbook, by the mid-'80s was being produced at the University of Utah, where all of that was being looked at and analyzed for weapons applications. That dish on that Humvee for creating heat sensations, by changing the frequency, waveform, pulse rate, or any number of perimeters, you can target any vital organ in the human body. Just depends on who's running the software and what that software is designed to do. And that's what they don't tell you. You know, these technologies are developed for multiple applications. The idea of going in and rebuilding countries is becoming more and more difficult for Americans to accept. The idea that we're spending hundreds and hundreds of millions or billions of dollars rebuilding countries. If you can go in with non-lethal weapons, somebody told me once it was the perfect Republican weapon. You know, you kill all the people, but you keep the property rolling. And I don't know if I agree with that, but the point is, these new technologies allow you to essentially damage the ultimate operator of any military equipment, which is the human being, and spare the equipment so you don't have to pay for the rebuild. That's where we're headed militarily. When you talk about these technologies, you're talking about technologies that are really controlled by the most sophisticated governments of the world. The reason technology issues are important to me, think about looking across the planet, where are the most powerful governments in the world? And they're the ones that command the greatest and most powerful technologies. Within democratic republics like ours, it then becomes incredibly important that the average person has at least a conceptual knowledge of what those technologies are. I mean, all of us that drove here today and look inside of a hood of a modern automobile go, it's spaghetti. None of us can fix those cars anymore, but we can drive them. We can conceptually operate the vehicle. But that same vehicle could be used to run someone over or bring you to a forum, right? Depends on the intent of the operator. If we start thinking about technology in those terms and quit being afraid of it, which so many people are, and recognize, look, we have to have at least conceptual knowledge because it's up to us as individuals to move the political bodies into a direction that is more conducive to human beings and more conducive to what happens internationally. When we start misapplying technology today, incredibly dangerous things can happen. We have the ability now, according to Secretary of Defense Cohen, former Secretary of Defense Cohen, to actually manipulate full environmental systems. He says terrorist states might have this capability. You know, you start thinking about technology transfers falling into that realm, we really do need to be educated. We need to look at what these technologies do, and we need to see some level of regulation. When you think about energy generally, I mean, like surrounding us right now, we talked about how much radio frequency energy is surrounding us. You guys have power failures here every once in a while? Mm-hmm. All right. First thing you notice when the power goes out is how quiet it is, because the refrigerator's not humming, the air conditioners aren't going, or whatever's happening. You know how quiet it is? But think about it for a moment, and almost everyone also feels this sort of sense of, right? Like a big exhale. Because your body is no longer having to compensate for these external fields. That on a very, very subtle level, you create a certain level of stress that's with every single person. You know what the sound of being born into an explosion is? Silence. You know, think about it. When you're in a crowded room and everyone's talking and you can sort of blank out everyone else, it's what we do. We sort of filter out all the noise and we don't notice it until the noise is gone. You notice the same thing when you go out into the country and you get out of urban areas. Immediately, you relax. If you're from New York City, how many people are from New York City? A couple. When you left New York City, were you really uneasy all the time? Yeah, and it's because you weren't surrounded by this thing that made you feel comfortable because it's your home-based feeling of this sort of high agitation. You get away from it and something's missing. And you're finally relaxing a little bit. And the other place you notice it, you're wearing shoes that insulate you from the ground. You know, the Earth has a frequency, it's called Schumann's resonance, discovered in the 50s, 7.83 hertz. Remember that little analogy, that alpha range, 7 to 11, 7 to 12 hertz, right in that range? Is the alpha range, ideal learning range. Isn't it interesting that the Earth would have a frequency very similar to be in that range of where a human being ideally is situated? And yet we surround ourselves with 60 cycle in the United States. That's how our power grid operates. So we're already agitated. You kill it, you relax, you notice it right away. You also notice it when you kick your shoes off, which is generally what people do when they walk into their house right away. You reground, you reconnect, and you immediately relax. You have that same exhale feeling. because you're grounded again, literally. I mean, you could solve it by injecting a little bit of carbon into the formation of the rubber soles of the shoes to make them conductive. You know the old story of the jogger? You know, the jogger who's really athletic and is in really great shape, and they're jogging all the time. Then all of a sudden they fall over with a heart attack, and everyone goes, "Oh, that was strange. You look, the guy was healthy." If you, in the right conditions, you could build up a large static charge, and you start to notice that if you're a jogger, you start getting cramping in the calves, and you're getting a migration of calcium out of the bones into soft tissue. If you could ground that out and knock that static charge off, you probably wouldn't get that migration, at least not as aggressively. But people don't think about this stuff until the lights go out. I'm relaxed. Why am I so relaxed? But energy, if you think about sort of what's happening in this area, again, going back to another document, it's called the Revolution of Military Affairs and Conflict Short of War. And this one was produced by the U.S. Army War College. It was done in, I believe it was '89. And it's an important one because this is like the discussion of where all this technology is going to go in terms of humankind, and the idea that, and what it says is that most of this kind of technology, like what we're talking about today, would be resisted by most of the American public on the basis that it violates American values. That's what it says in this paper. And it talks about a few other things. It talks about the use of implant technologies for monitoring the movements of troops within a battle environment. And if you think about it, they're already doing this with special forces, where they get a little transponder under the skin so that when they're in the battlefield, they can actually track their movements, locate people with great precision. Heads of state across the world receive this kind of technology. They're now introducing it to folks with degenerative diseases for the elderly that are losing mental faculties. They're talking about using it in children because they might get kidnapped. And they're talking in this particular military paper, they said we need to use this for people traveling abroad. Of course, we won't activate these things unless there's a conflict. And if you believe that, there's a bridge for sale across the river here. The point is, it's this idea of a more directed and controlled society. Now, what do they say in this? They say, it'll violate American values, and therefore we can't do it, right? That's what we would think. That's what we'd want people educating our military personnel to believe, that, hey, if it violates American values, don't do it. Instead, they paint a couple of scenarios. Another technology they introduced, I want to mention this just briefly, is the idea of being able to locate, say, a plane load of terrorists coming into the country. They use that as an example, or drug traffickers. You're able to isolate the plane, and then using some of our new technologies, able to send in an energy discharge, an EMP, capable of knocking out the avionics, the things that control that ability of that plane to fly. So you cause it to crash, it burns up, and everyone's dead. And then they raise the sort of the constitutional questions, juries, judges, trials, those kinds of little inconveniences get raised, and they say, but if we're outside of the United States, maybe the Constitution doesn't apply. Now, that really bothers me, because when I think of our military men and women, whether I agree with the conflict or not, leaving the boundaries of the United States, that is what they carry with them. They don't leave it at home and go ship people all over the world where they can be tortured, right? We don't want to see our militaries doing that. But this is exactly the kind of arguments they make in this paper, and they say, but what happens if we make a mistake? Well, we've got deniability. How many remember, one of the examples they give is we downed an aircraft that doesn't contain the terrorists or the drug traffickers. How many remember the Peruvian Air Force knocking out an airplane with a missionary and his child, killed them both based on our intelligence? So it happened. It happened 10 years after the paper was written, but it happened. And no one even bats an eye. It's the misuse of technology. If you have the ability to track somebody coming in on an aircraft, then wait till they land and do it in the appropriate way, arrest somebody, give them a trial the way that we're supposed to do that, whether it's here or there. I mean, it's our military personnel supposedly carrying our set of values. The thing that it said in this paper that became the most disturbing is to say the only way Americans will change their value system and accept this new wave of technology is in an environment of fear, predicated on the idea of international terrorism, international drug trafficking. Think about the PSAs that you're seeing on the television today that tie those two issues together. You go back to that original document, again, our Revolution Military Affairs and Conflict Short of War, U.S. Army War College, it was '89 or '90, and you see the whole scenario played out. How many column inches have been dedicated to terrorism and drug trafficking compared to, say, medical malpractice? How many people have died of terrorist events within the United States in the last decade? Maybe 5,000 if you add Oklahoma City and you add everything up. Maybe 5,000. A lot of people. According to Harvard, in the same 10 years, 1 million people died of medical malpractice. Now, which is the bigger problem? And which one should be getting some coverage? Which one ought to be getting some resources? Most of those are drug interactions that are readily solved by utilizing database-driven prescription systems where the computer says, hey, wait, you're going to have an interaction because physician A and physician B are giving you drugs that conflict. And even the same physician can give you drugs that conflict and not even realize it because the interactions are so complex. These things are places that we could actually put some effort and solve some problems that actually might result in a whole lot of people living instead of narrowing the target maybe in the wrong direction. But what happens in an environment of fear? What have we seen since 9/11? The book Earthrising the Revolution, which is back there, was written sort of before 9/11 to say, these are the things that are coming. These are the things that we should be doing to preempt it. Earthrising 2 was after 9/11 saying it's too late because the same discussions about implant technology as an example, which would have been rejected, are now people are talking about it as if it's maybe not such a bad idea. Now, if you were a military person going into combat, you might want that technology. If you get lost, captured, you might want them to be able to locate you. You might want it. But as we all know, in the military, you don't get an option, you get an order. Now, you think about anthrax vaccines, some of the other things that created controversy with military personnel in the past. The biggest victims of human experimentation, and this was probably the toughest thing we wrote, was in Earthrising Revolution, a chapter on human experimentation in the United States. Secretary of Energy O'Leary, when she was in that position under the Clinton administration, said over 500,000 Americans have been victims of human experimentation over a 40-year period in the United States without consent. 500,000 that they admit to. Now, this involved everything from radioactive iodine injections in Eskimos and Inupiats in Alaska to see how they would die over time in Arctic regions, to injecting syphilis into blacks in the Southeast to see how they would die over their lifetimes, and all kinds of gross uses and misuses of technology. There's a number of references in Earthrising that kind of spell it out. It's the toughest thing to write. And the biggest group of victims was military personnel because they get orders. And the area that came out was actually there was a big controversy. How many remember the MK Ultra controversies of the 70s? Not too many. This made it in a congressional record. There's actually a congressional report that was put together. It was actually a presidential report in 1976, and it was misuses by the Central Intelligence Agency. And back in the 60s, when there was a lot of anti-war activity within the United States, Central Intelligence Agency was infiltrating domestic groups, intercepting their mail, their phone communications. And at the same time, they had this program, MK Ultra, where they were using chemical and other means, LSD, hallucinogenics, on military service personnel to see what would happen, experimentally. And this presidential report actually sort of laid out what they were doing. Most of the records were shredded. The guy who ran the program, Gottlieb, when the congressional inquiries began, started shredding at the Central Intelligence Agency. And the thing that he didn't shred that showed up later, he got the programs themselves shredded, but he didn't get the accounting records, which were in some other area. So those were FOIA'd a number of years ago by friends of mine, which actually show a lot more than the chemical means from behavior modification they were attempting then. But there was also a use of electromagnetic fields and other systems that were mechanically based to create the same kind of outcomes. And if you go back to this whole area of mind control, you really got to go back to the Korean War, the Korean conflict. And when we had prisoners of war returning, we found that some of these young men actually were found standing on street corners handing out communist leaflets, as an example. It's not a popular thing in the 50s in the United States. And we were saying, what happened? And the phrase brainwashing, that phrase was coined after the Korean War because of these observations. So we got very interested and became very interested in seeing sort of, can we do this? How can we do this? And our Central Intelligence Agency got heavily involved. By the early 60s, during the Vietnam conflict, I think it was like 64, 65, we actually captured a device called a LIDA machine, L-I-D-A. And it was a Russian device that was used using oscillations of light and sound and electromagnetic fields for creating trance-like states in prisoners of war for extracting intelligence during the Vietnam era. So we captured one of these. That became pretty interesting. There was some technologies developed. One of the original technologies developed actually in the late 50s was a device called the Neurophone. How many have heard of that? A few. The Neurophone was invented by a guy, Patrick Flanagan, and it was essentially a device that would take a sound signal. And let me kind of describe it, and I'll demonstrate a similar device here today in the next half of this presentation. But what it would do is, if you think about sound wave, like my voice, striking your outer ear, this is your array. This is your directional array. Like if you close your eyes, because of the shape of the ear, you can kind of distinguish where sound is coming from. If you distort the array and then try it, it's very, very difficult to figure it out. So this is your array. Sound wave hits it, concentrates that sound wave into the inner ear, vibrates the eardrum. There's a small amount of fluid between the eardrum, and then there's the hearing mechanism. 3 small bones begin to vibrate, and there's a whole mechanism that eventually ends at the 8th cranial nerve that takes what then becomes a digital electromagnetic signal transferring through the nervous system to the brain, and the brain decodes that and says, okay, that's sound. And so you hear voice, you hear music, you hear whatever. What this circuit does is essentially replicate everything that's going on up to the 8th cranial nerve, and then attaches that signal on nerves that then bring it into the brain, and the brain interprets it as sound. So you hear that proverbial voice in the head. Now, when we were in the European Parliament, we took one of these devices with us, what the literature would refer to as an infrasound device, and we demonstrated it. Now, it shows up in the literature. They'd heard about them. Infrasound devices, no one ever demonstrated one. We demonstrated it. And then we suggested that this could also be done remotely, because this particular device required a physical contact with the apparatus. And we said for some time that we believed the technology was already around, but here's a story that actually ran, an Associated Press story originating in Portland on April 22nd this year, where a guy named Elwood Norris received it was the Lemelson MIT Prize for inventing a device that would send a sound signal so you could directionally orient it, and I could send a sound into any individual's head in this room and nobody else would hear it. He won a $500,000 prize from MIT for that. And we've said all along that this is exactly what would eventually happen in terms of technology. And I think this is, again, an extremely important area, because this is where the right and the left can shake hands politically, is anything that interferes with human brain performance that isn't voluntary ought to be strongly objected to, no matter what your political persuasion is. I mean, if the Founding Fathers could figure out that freedom of speech, assembly, religion all first required freedom of thought, and the whole idea that you could interfere with that, that would have been the First Amendment. Thou shalt not do that. And as a result, when you start talking about these issues, they become the most compelling, because that is the issue that I consider the most important. And when we come back from the break, we're going to have about a 12-minute segment, so some other scientists will weigh in on this issue, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. And we'll probably I'm going to go another hour of presentation, and then we'll go to questions. So we'll have a pretty good bit of time. So it's about 10 after now, or is it right up, straight up? We're straight up at 2, so let's take it till quarter after and then come back, and Jordan will probably let us all know. And before we take the break, let's acknowledge the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event for making this happen today.
He said, all American want to see Russian mind control technology. Come with me.
Blurbalicious. It's outrageous. It's controversial. It's the movie blurb.
They're completely shameless.
Hi, I'm Wendy Mesley, and this is Undercurrents. Mind control is a popular theme in our stories, but usually it's advertisers or the media who are behind it. Well, tonight we have a spookier tale to tell.
I was trying to relax, and I couldn't because of negative feelings coming into me. And
I got the sense sometimes of a presence, as if someone was in the room with me.
I was just like, where are these thoughts coming from?
Those thoughts came from the Neuroscience Laboratory at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, where Dr. Michael Persinger and his graduate students are experimenting with manipulating human thought and emotion with electromagnetic fields.
Well, effectively, all consciousness is due to electromagnetic patterns generated within the brain. What we do is imitate what the brain normally does and apply it experimentally.
It might look like the rec room from hell, but here, Dr. Persinger is able to map the electrical activity of the brain and duplicate it. He can then override the natural electrical activity and stimulate cells in the subject's brain to generate artificial emotions and awareness.
What we're going to do is we're simply going to ask you a few questions.
Okay.
Did you experience anger?
Yeah, I was mad at someone.
Okay. And you felt vibrations moving through your body?
At one point, in the back of my head, I felt something moving around.
In the early 1980s, the U.S. military found Persinger's work interesting enough to give him a small research grant. He's not alone. According to a recent article from the U.S. Army War College Quarterly, research in this area is intense.
Whoever replicates what nature does will have a powerful tool to control human thought.
No wonder mind control is so attractive to the U.S. military. What if governments could sway your opinions without you realizing it? During the Cold War, one of the secret battles between East and West was to develop technology to do just that.
I think any sophisticated government with a decent technology base is either working on these technologies or already has them. This is a published document. It's not released.
Nick Begich is what the U.S. military refers to as an accumulator, a self-appointed watchdog who, from his home in Alaska, pieces together bits of information he culls from the military's own documents.
Now what we're talking about is the idea that you can actually manipulate the thoughts of individuals. The U.S. military has had a long-standing interest in these technologies.
That's no big secret. In the 60s, Canadians were the unwitting guinea pigs for CIA-sponsored mind control experiments at McGill's Allen Institute in Montreal. Back then, the Americans and Soviets were in a race to develop a method to control the human mind. But when the experiments became public, the U.S. Congress banned the CIA from funding any further research into the subject. At least, that's the official story.
They get caught. They apologize, they ask forgiveness, a decade passes and they do it again. And to expect anything different is unrealistic and naive.
So you think the CIA is into this?
Absolutely.
According to Nick, one of the top priorities in American military circles these days is the development of non-lethal weapons, which supposedly don't kill, just incapacitate the enemy. Sound like mind control? You know, some people are listening to this are going to think you're nuts. There's no way.
The military describes it the best. This is a revolution in military affairs. This is a change so profound it's going to change the very way in which war is fought. And it is going to be fantastic, and it is going to be unbelievable. But the reality is, it's here, and it's here now.
And it's only just recently that word has begun to leak out.
So much in the last 50 years has been hidden from public debate. You know, only now, and largely now, these discussions are taking place because of information that's flowing out of the former Soviet Union.
Remember them? The evil empire? Well, back in 1991, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Pentagon sent a team to Moscow to find out what secret military technology the Soviets had up their sleeve. That team was led by Chris and Janet Morris, both strategic planners for the U.S. military. The Morrises are intrigued by mind control. They're limited in what they can do at home, but they would talk about their experience with the Russians.
About midnight one night, knock came on our hotel door, and it was a KGB guy. He said, "All American want to see Russian mind control technology. Come with me." We said, "Oh boy."
The Morrises were taken to the Institute of Psychocorrections, where they were introduced to Dr. Igor Smirnov and his mind control machine. These days, introductions are a little easier. Smirnov wants the world to know what he's got. He needs the money.
This is called computerized psychotechnology. First, we gather information from the subconscious. Then we determine how a specific personality works.
And then they asked if they would like if we would like them to demonstrate. And we pointed to him.
And all of a sudden, on came the phones on came the screen, out went the lights, and all the people left the room and left me there staring at the screen, and I said, I'm really in trouble now.
Officially for psychiatric use, this device was born of the long-standing Soviet effort to get inside the head of the enemy. At normal speed, the numbers on the screen appear meaningless. But when we slowed down our video frame by frame, we found subliminal flashes of words. Words like fear and neurosis. These words trigger electrical activity responses in the brain and reveal private anxieties and other weaknesses.
And this command, which is brought in bypassing the consciousness, has the same effect as a commandment. It's like a word of God. So we simply cannot disobey it.
So we said, well, what are the applications? And they said, well, they had tested with the simple phrase, bring us cake, and that they had piped that bring us cake in white noise up to the ground level, masquerading as just machinery noise, and both the workmen outside and their colleagues who worked on the ground level within 24 hours had come at different times of the day bringing them cake.
But if you'll block your ears tightly so you don't hear the signal.
What have the Americans got? Officially nothing. It was banned, remember? But Nick Begich got his hands on a 30-year-old prototype called a Neurophone. To demonstrate, he hooked it up to a Discman. The Neurophone changes the music to a digital signal, one above the normal threshold for human hearing. You can't hear the music in your ears, but your brain picks it up.
When these contact the skin, the signal actually moves through the nervous system to the brain.
So it's coming through my nervous system?
Through the nervous system, and then the brain breaks the code down, and so you perceive it as an internal signal as opposed to something external.
No, I do hear something. Yeah, right in the front of my forehead. Yeah, I hear it
right in the center of the cranium.
Could it be done so I wouldn't even know?
Yes, it could be done at a subliminal level, at a level that wasn't consciously perceptible.
Could this be done without actually attaching an electrode to me? Could you do this remotely?
Using a microwave carrier, this could be done remotely.
So I'd never know.
You'd never know that you were being influenced unless you knew the technology was being directed at you at the moment.
Nick even wonders if mind control technology was used during the Gulf War. Remember all those pictures of thousands of Iraqi soldiers surrendering as if on cue?
All of the symptoms that were being exhibited would be the same kind of symptoms you would expect from high-energy pulse microwave weapon systems.
The Defense Department denies even having the technology, let alone using it in the Gulf. But that doesn't faze Nick.
I believe they were deployed in the Gulf conflict and will be deployed in future conflicts.
But the Morrises say Russian mind control technology was almost used on U.S. soil.
It so happened that Dr. Smirnov was visiting in the United States at the time that David Koresh and his followers were holed up in the ranch in Waco.
The FBI asked me to use our means to destabilize the situation in Texas.
Before one assumes that something is all bad, it's very important to consider these moments where using an influence to bring someone out of a hostage situation or a standoff is clearly better than roasting them all alive.
We signed an agreement that gave me 10 days to prepare the operation. I was thinking about recording an appeal from close relatives, say parents or children of those who were there. Then I wanted to transform them into subconscious form. And then I wanted to use powerful speakers as well as the computer network, television, and radio to exert influence on all members of the sect. And so, 3 days later, the atmosphere was very tense, and probably some important boss in Washington made the decision not to wait for the Russian bear to get everything ready. This really did destabilize the situation, but in the wrong direction. It all ended in tragedy.
Those of us who tried to streamline it enough to allow the FBI a chance to try it felt devastated.
The FBI will neither deny nor confirm they ever met with Dr. Smirnov.
By some quirk of fate, I've become the inventor of what is probably a new way of controlling humans. In essence, that's a weapon. A kitchen knife can be used to cut sausage or to cut the throat. Everything depends on whose hands are using the method, not the method itself.
And that's the crux, because in this media age, there are so many possible carriers for subliminal messages.
Especially TV and radio, as well as products distributed through the internet, or about audio or video cassettes or CDs. If our methodology is used through these sorts of channels, then a very large number of people could be affected.
Seriously? Janet Morris thinks so.
And we did look at trying to get the U.S. government to evaluate technologies like this enough to develop a series of chips that you could put in VCRs, telephones, TV sets that would screen out carriers on other signals.
Okay, good, thanks. It can be quite simple. Suppose a media, a television system, radio system, indicts an ethnic group for being responsible for all your difficulties. And then that night, somebody generates a complex magnetic field to the entire population, which produces a negative feeling. It can be actually quite simple, but still very powerful.
It means that huge numbers of people, even entire nations, in the end everyone, could be changed without knowing it. If just one powerful person wants that to happen, it scares
signals in, and that's a major point that I missed in the first part of this presentation. Let me read a short quote. This comes out of a publication, again, from the U.S. Army War College. It's they have a quarterly called Perimeters, and this is an article that originally ran in a publication called Orienteer, which is a Russian military journal. It was edited and rewritten, and this is what it says, and I'll just quote one section of this. A psychotronic generator which produces a powerful electromagnetic emanation capable of being sent through telephone lines, TV, radio networks, supply pipes, and incandescent lamps. This signal would manipulate the behavior of those in contact with the signal, unquote. Same thing that these guys are saying. Essentially, utilizing any of these methods, you can carry a signal in below the level of hearing where you don't even perceive what's going on. In Japan, we actually found a patent that involved some of this. In Japan, they were using this in department stores, you know, where the elevator music is playing, and then in 7 languages below the level of perceptible hearing, they had in 7 languages messages to dissuade shoplifters, and they saw a 40% decrease in shoplifting within their department stores. Now, you think about that, you go, well, that's a good idea. Well, what if they're trying to sell you the socks that aren't moving in the inventory? You know, I mean, these are, again, things that are not so regulated in many parts of the world, including ours, and the ability to discern when systems are being operated. When we looked at what Smirnov was saying, and essentially what he was saying is, these systems bypass the conscious, that part that sorts out right and wrong, good and evil, that makes the value judgments that we all come to, drops right into the subconscious in a way that becomes incredibly compelling. So from my perspective, you know, where does military technology eventually end up is in the civilian sector at some point down the road. When you talk about learning programs, accelerated learning programs, the kinds of things the military is looking for. In the book, Earthrising the Revolution, there's people asked on one of these cards, where do you get your information? There's over 1,300 source documents cited in the 3 main books back there. And these are all public documents. Some of them are FOIA. Probably 98% of them are not FOIAs, Freedom of Information Act requests. They're just stuff that you can go find in good libraries through the internet or through interlibrary loan. Now, since 9/11, a lot of stuff has come down. You can't get it off the web the way you used to. All of our archives are hard copied. Anytime we quote something, if you look in Earthrising or Earthrising Revolution, on the bottom of every page where we make statements, there's exactly where it came from. So you can go look. You don't have to go flipping around. You can go see, okay, where did this come from, and see it statement by statement. And at the end of each of these is a number that starts with EPI, and that's our internal file number. And we use that for media and for political leadership. and organizations that are going to do something, and they contact us and say, hey, how do we get copies of this? We've got them all. So even though on some of these, the web stuff is gone, we have the original hard copies that we use when we quote it, and we keep all of that. And there's, Sheila will tell you, there's 80 boxes now in storage to be archived, and probably another 70 or 80 that have some state of work left to do on them. So there's a lot of material that we develop over the years. And from that, we pick the best, and that's what we use in our public presentations. But this particular article, The Mind Has No Firewalls, in the U.S. Army Quarterly, is extremely revealing in terms of where the technology is, why it's important. Now, when you see this stuff migrating into the civilian sector in, say, 10 or 15 years, what are the kinds of things that they're envisioning? They believe that at some point they're going to get an understanding of the human brain and how memory is stored to actually create memory sets and literally download them. So you can gather a language perhaps in a few days rather than many years. You know, that kind of technology is being looked at. And we got a long way to go, at least in the open literature, to get there. But remember, what's in the open literature is just a grain of sand on the beach of information, because so much isn't revealed publicly these days. But what happens then? So you have compulsory education, you have systems for transferring information very efficiently, and what do you have in terms of people regulating the curriculum? You know, who's going to regulate the future downloads 10, 15, 20 years from now of kids in terms of what they believe are integrated into their belief systems? And for those that study psychology in the group, if those things that they dump into the brain conflict with their basic belief systems, you know, that's the root of an awful lot of psychosis. So a lot of problems can come from misuse, a misapplication of technology, otherwise are kind of interesting. Now, we got a section in Earthrise and Revolution on the mind control topic, and I want to just read the opening quote, which comes from this comes from New World Vistas, Air and Space Power for the 21st Century. It's the ancillary volume, and it's from the Science Advisory Board of the Air Force, and it's from 1996. And this is what they're projecting will become possible. And I quote, "It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body, raising the possibility of covert suggestion in psychological direction. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them," unquote. Remember that proverbial voice in the head? This was predicted in 1996 to be 20 years in the offing. And if you remember, just before the break, I mentioned Norris's MIT Levinson Prize for being able to do exactly that, transfer that voice in the head. Now, when you think about all that and you start looking at, well, what are the other misuses? I think it's pretty obvious. The idea that you can utilize any of these various methods that we depend on for carrying signals in, who really controls that? You know, people are taking a look now at what's happening in this area of information war, and it's more than just messing up your computer with a virus. Information war is about ultimately affecting the operator, or what the military today is referring to as controlled effects. Controlled effects are really stratified into kind of three areas. One is the idea of affecting hardware, equipment. One is affecting software, that which directs that equipment, using energy to override information, or affect the operator, ultimately the human being. This is a publication that I'm sure you all subscribe to. It's Air Force Research Labs Technology Horizons. It's one of those obscure kind of journals, and there's an article from the June 2004 issue on controlled effects. This is put together by Kirkland Air Force Base's Directed Energy Directorate, which deals with this type of technology. And this is what they're predicting is going to become possible, and I quote, "By studying and modeling the human brain and nervous system, the ability to mentally influence or confuse personnel is also possible. Through sensory deception, it may be possible to create synthetic images or holograms to confuse an individual's visual sense, or in a similar manner, confuse his senses of sound, taste, touch, or smell," unquote. In other words, to give you these full experiences that engage all of the senses in a way that sort of fools the brain into believing that it's real when it's in fact not. That's where this is headed. That is a big, big change from where we are today, and some people believe the technology has already been reached because they're talking about it. My personal belief is it's a little more complicated than that, but we're headed down this path pretty rapidly. In the context of all of the things that we've researched in technology, and we do a lot of different things in technology. I mean, in the books, you'll see things on the underwater sonars that have created a lot of controversy. There's things on cell phones that are very well documented. Personal privacy-related technologies are documented there. Lots of technology trends and sort of how these all come together. This I consider to be the most critical of all because of the potential impact on political and social systems. When you think about China's development in information warfare and military technologies, people discount them dramatically. They say they only spend, we estimate, $40 billion a year in defense expenditures in China. Compared to the US this year, they're just fighting over the $440 billion. And we say, well, it's only, what is it, less than 10% of what we're spending. But go see what you get in China for $40 billion. You don't pay $250,000 a year for top-notch Chinese scientists. You've got a centralized system that takes the brightest and the most brilliant, starting at very young ages, and start routing people into their career paths to benefit a national agenda that's an ideological agenda that's quite contrary to our own. And the reality is, this is the kind of technology that people that are technically dependent like us become highly vulnerable to. Can you introduce this kind of technology to the internet as an example? And the answer is yes. And you can do that from virtually anywhere in the world. Could you introduce it? Could you override radio broadcasts like what we suggested might have been possible during the first Gulf War? And these references in this video were all to the first Gulf conflict. We said, yeah, this is what it looks like. We don't have the evidence of it. After the Gulf War, there was a Scottish press report that came out that said they used silent subliminals and other means that they actually embedded into the radio broadcasts into the region. So those broadcasts sending in the Muslim music and prayers where all these guys were tuned in, there was signals embedded on those that actually created anxiety and fear, which caused people, the fourth largest army in the world, to give up like kids on their first fire drill. It didn't make any sense. They said it was, well, we bombarded them so heavily. Think about Dresden and London during World War II, where civilian populations were bombed day in and day out for years, literally, and you didn't see that happen. There had to be something else, and the Scottish media pointed that out as perhaps the most effective weapon system that we could have developed, was something that created that sort of anxiety. The other thing that I can say along this line is when you start to look at sort of the trends and the debates that are happening within military arenas, it's not about how to amplify American values, it's how to preempt them, how to escape them, how to sidestep them to introduce technologies that most of us would find objectionable. And that's the advent of 9/11. Now we're in an environment of fear-driven decision-making. And the thing I strongly disagree with what Smirnov said, these are not things to be fearful of. These are things to be cognizant of so that we can then begin to make positive steps to informing those that make the decisions for the rest of us and see some political change. And I think we'll eventually see that. It takes a long time to get issues into what is considered the common knowledge. Like if 50 years ago somebody come to me and said, look at this hole in my chest, a perfectly burned hole through my chest. Everybody look at him and they said, yeah, a light beam hit me. And everyone would look at him 50 years ago and say, well, you're nuts. Today, everyone in this room would say, well, that was a laser. I mean, that's the first thing everybody would think of. We don't know how to make a laser, right? None of us in the room. But we know that's what it'll do because it's in the common knowledge. Our mission for the last several years, and will be for the next several, is to try and get in the common knowledge in the same way that we did with HAARP to a large extent, this understanding of the technology so we can begin to see perhaps some positive changes in terms of how it's being misused. I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of other applications. I want to talk about the body itself, and I mentioned this thing about, when you come in and you kick your shoes off, and how the body is really, it really does have a lot to do with these external fields and the energy that affects us. And this is something I think has been known for a long time. How many saw the Discovery Channel thing on the Iceman a few years ago? Do you remember the Iceman, the guy they found frozen in the Alps? And he had all his pharmaceuticals from the, whatever they used back then before pharmaceuticals, all his herbs and all this stuff with them. And they were doing the autopsy. And one of the guys involved in that autopsy noticed that he had tattoos that correlated with acupuncture points and meridians all over his body. And so they then did the autopsy and determined that the illnesses and physical disorders he had actually lined up with those acupuncture points and meridians. Now this is supposedly this guy was 5,000 years old, and acupuncture, and this is Europe, you know, northern Italy, southern Germany, I guess, depending on what country you're in, and arguing about who gets the body, because that's been going on too. But everybody thought and everybody believes that acupuncture originated in China. And now here you have something that predates. So what really happened? Now this is my theory. I want to say theory really loud, okay, because it is just a theory. The idea is that if you take away all this soup that surrounds us, all this energy that surrounds us is artificially created, perhaps there was a time when certain individuals were sensitive enough to be able to determine these acupuncture points and meridians universally by being able to understand something about that energy. Now, the thing about acupuncture points and meridians, they don't line up with the circulatory system or the nervous system or the muscles groupings. They're another system independent. And people say, well, how can you quantify them? And you can. They actually, on the surface of the skin, you can measure the skin resistance differs. And wherever there's an acupuncture point, you can actually locate it by measuring that difference. This is a acupuncture device. This one actually locates the points and then stimulates the points using electromagnetic fields. And it uses just like a little 9-volt battery and a 10 hertz signal, and it stimulates those points. But it'll locate them on the end of the index finger, on the thumb side, right where the nail sort of hits the tissue. There's an acupuncture point there, and this I'll use as an example. This has 2 dials. One sets the power and one sets the sensitivity. I'm touching a metal plate on this little device to create a loop, because when I touch this, I'm going to get a little signal. You hear that? Can you hear that in the back? So if I take this, and there's also a light signal. You can't really see it because it's a little bit too bright in the room. But as I move and I find that signal or find that point, I get a nice clear signal and I get a light, so I've located it. But I can find all of the points on my body just by measuring skin resistance. So my theory goes that these ancients, without all the interference, there were a few people that could actually make those distinctions, could actually discern that differential, and that's why you see the Iceman 5,000 years ago holding the same knowledge that was held in China. And I think when you start talking about the body itself, you think about the body, how do we approach it in terms of Western health? We approach it from sort of the outside in. You go see the MD and they look at you, they do a few temperature measurements, they might even do some sophisticated scanning, but that's kind of where it ends. But if you think about what we are, it starts with energy. It then goes to atoms and molecules and cell formation and body components and then the gross body. And what you affect at an energetic level can have profound effects biochemically. And people use this, it used to be strictly a chemical model for the body. And then they talk about an electrochemical model for the body, which is kind of where most of the people are today. But I think there's an electromagnetic component of the body and everything manifests out of that. And many are starting to say that. And when you start looking at manipulating energy, like acupuncture, you know, people want the instant cure, so the pharmaceutical they pop, they get the immediate relief of symptoms. Acupuncture tends to take time because you're rebalancing systems, you're changing something fundamentally in terms of the way energy flows and the way the body reacts. The interesting part of all that is when you start thinking about the body as an energy system, and that these external signals interact with that energy system in very unique ways. You can talk about the radio frequency dosimetry handbook put together by the Air Force for looking at how does radio frequency affect the heart, the liver, the lungs, and so on. Every single cell, body organ has a unique resonant frequency. Every element has a unique resonant frequency. If you send energy in, for instance, if I targeted this group with energy that resonated at the same frequency as iodine, we all have iodine in our bodies, we need it for our health. Too much of it will make us sick or kill us. You can create an illusion for the body where that signal comes in, the body believes it's just gotten a massive dose of iodine, begins to exhibit all the symptoms of iodine poisoning, yet when they check the thyroid or do blood work, nothing shows up. It's a mystery illness. You can target the heart, disrupt the heart, cause someone to have a heart attack. They go to the doctors, they get checked out, there's no tissue damage beyond that caused by a heart attack, and the diagnosis goes down, heart failure. The thing to watch for is when you got a crowd having a heart attack all at once. That doesn't statistically work. So then you know something else is going on. But the point is, this is the crux of what much of the revolution in military affairs is about, is looking for these methods for affecting health, utilizing energy as a medium. When we were in the European Parliament, we demonstrated the neurophonic technology. Friends of mine in Germany advanced it a bit and developed this technology. This is essentially doing what I had mentioned earlier, and these are using piezoelectric transducers for actually transferring a signal. And this is that same Sony Walkman you saw in that undercurrent segment. But basically what happens, these are piezoelectric transducers. So they have like a metal plate on the outside that you see, and then inside on the other side is a little ceramic material that when electric current hits it, it expands and contracts, and it causes a little bit of electrical discharge, and it also causes a bit of a drumming effect on this outer shell. So you'll hear it with the outer ear. But if I take this, click this on, place this on the surface of the skin so both contacts make a loop because there's power going through this, and you block your ears, you'll actually hear the signal within the head. Maybe I can get a volunteer. Maybe I get 2 volunteers. This gentleman in the far back and this woman in the front. Come on forward. We'll use 2 people. Because I want to do 2 things. First, and then they can tell you what they're sensing. And you should be able to hear this signal. Through the microphone as well, because that drumming effect will create a little bit of a signal. Let's see if we can hear it. Can you hear that? Okay, let's have you come up. Okay, what I'm going to ask her to do is block her ears so she's not picking up that external signal. And then I'm going to place this just on her face, and then what will happen is that'll carry the signal, and she should be able to perceive it within the cranium. And when I remove it, it'll stop because you don't have the looping effect. Step on up here for a moment. And then I want you to hold this one, just hold that so you get a metal contact. Just touch her anywhere on her where she touch the skin. Okay. She's hearing it again, only now the signal's looping through her and him, which means that energy vibration that's creating the signal is actually resonating their whole energy fields to the same input signal. So if you put a group of people, now we've done this with as many as 10. Let me try this also. We've done this as many as 10, and you get no appreciable decrease in sound volume, which means there's no real resistance, just kind of flowing right through both systems. So what did you guys hear?
Music. Yeah, heard the music.
And where was it?
In your head. Yeah, I couldn't really tell, like it's just right around in here, I guess.
All right. Thank you both. When we finish up, I'll hang around, and people want to try this, we can let you try this. But the basic idea here was to take a sound signal, transfer that sound signal, directly into the head. Now, what are the applications? Well, this device has, if you looked at it on an oscilloscope, it has a square waveform, all right? So it's got real flat surfaces when you look at that waveform. It also has voltage. The voltage on this is about 60 volts peak to peak, which means it's pretty small voltage. It's very, very small in terms of milliamperage. If we could increase this to 3,000 volts peak to peak and move it from a square wave to a sine wave, which we can do that, which gives you a very sharp, fast drive time. This looks like a needle. What this has application for is hearing impaired, because it transfers that signal extremely efficiently. And with that kind of voltage, this device you got to use from the shoulders up, not enough power to carry it. It just doesn't seem to be able to carry that signal. And the square wave tends to hit the nervous system flat, whereas that more of a pin type of an effect pierces the nervous system more effectively. The problem that we've had, and maybe some of you that are technically oriented keep an eye out for this, is when this device was first developed back in the neurophonic days, back in the 60s, they didn't have integrated circuits as such. So RF interference wasn't a problem. When we get up to higher voltages, we start to get interference where it affects cell phones and other electronic devices, and it won't clear the regulatory authorities. So we have to find a way to shield the RF so we can increase the power level, and then we think we'll have extremely good applications for hearing impaired. The other place is because it affects the entire energetic system of the body, And it basically harmonizes you to the input signal. What they've seen is some use in, and there was a study done, an independent study done, and it tended to balance acupuncture meridians for about a week or two after use for about a half an hour, provided you didn't have some trauma or some major event disrupt you during the course of the week. So for balancing the energetic system of the body. And the other place where people have used it experimentally is in accelerated learning applications. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. And also for in utero learning. You know, where they have in that third trimester where a lot of neural connections are being formed. And the idea is, you know, there's a lot of people that say, you know, you sing to your child and all this, but if you've ever tried to listen to sound, there's a lot of distortion. So you don't get nice, clean auditory signals. With this, you get clear, precise auditory signals. So you're able to establish what they believe, theoretically goes, that you can establish more neural connections in the unborn child. So when the child is born, there's more going on there intellectually, and they develop more rapidly. Anecdotally, there's been some success in that area in Europe where this device has been out for 4 or 5 years and people have a chance to work with it. And so sound wave, from the purposes politically, this has made it very easy for us to move the infrasound debate in the European Parliament because we had something we could demonstrate, something that was hands-on. One of the other things that I mentioned during the presentation was this idea of flickering light effects and what happened with those kids in Japan going to the hospital with epileptic seizures. When you think about affecting the human brain, radio frequency energy we've talked about, but light, if you can flicker light at between, say, 7 hertz, 8 hertz, 9 hertz, your brain will actually entrain to that signal, just like those kids watching that program. Or you can use what's called a binaural beat, which is using sound. Now to get in that ELF range, and let me go over that again. This is extremely low frequency ranges that the brain has predominant brain activity within these ranges, and I'll go over it again. It's the 1 to 4 hertz or cycles or pulses or vibrations per second. 1 to 4 is delta, deep sleep. The next stage, theta, which is sort of awakened sleep, which is about up to 7 hertz, and then 7 to 11, 12 hertz is the alpha range, and then say 12 to 20 is kind of where we are in most of our beta states. Unless we're agitated, we start to go higher. And this is predominant brain activity. So with binaural beat, our ears can't hear signals that low. So a guy named Robert Monroe years ago developed a system where he actually took a sound signal, say, coming in one ear at, say, 17 cycles per second or vibrations per second, 17,000 hertz, and one, say, coming in the other ear at 17,007, they get into the brain and they cancel and leave the difference. 17,000, 17,007 leaves a beat frequency of 7. The brain locks onto that. And what happens in the course of locking onto it is it creates a whole brain effect where the brain has energy distributed around, kind of randomly around. With this, it creates both hemispheres get an energy distribution that's approximately the same. Both hemispheres begin to work together, the creative and the analytical, the way they were intended to work together. So you get some pretty powerful effects. And what they did at the Monroe Institute is they looked at people with anomalous capacities, brain functions, super meditators, super learners, people with incredible memories, began to look at what was going on within the brain and then develop essentially what I call human software for stimulating those portions of the brain so that you can replicate that as an average individual and creating this whole brain effect, which is the ideal state for accelerated learning. You know, the right and the brain, left brain were designed to work together. What happens in education in the United States is we screw it up. You know, first of all, we start kids way too soon. You know, when I said 3 to 5-year-olds are predominantly operating in this theta range, which is, think about what kids are learning in that age. Language, social skills, I mean, they're like sponges just sucking it in. And what do? We put them into a situation of academic learning that physiologically they're not able to engage. And so then we begin overdiagnosing these kids with learning disabilities because they're not mature enough physiologically to do that academic learning that we're trying to shove at them at 3 and 4 years old in the United States. In Europe, they start their kids, in most of Europe, they start them in school around 7, which is when the brain is ready to begin that kind of analytical learning. So when you start to think about sort of the overdiagnosis, it really leads to a lot of problems. And you see it during the break. I was reminded, you've got a couple practitioners here in neurobiofeedback, brain biofeedback. How many have heard of that in the room? more than most groups, so that's really good. This is the idea, again, biofeedback, the idea of getting the information. When you learn how to ride a bicycle, how many have ever tried to do that by reading a book? Forget it. You get on it, you ride it, you figure it out, and you set the bike down, and maybe 20 years later, you pick it up and you can ride it because you've laid it down, you've learned it by this experiential learning, which is locked in, and you've gotten feedback. You got on, you fell down, you had all the sensations, you've learned how to do it. With brain biofeedback, where they've had really good success is in addictions, and they've also had really good success in attention deficit disorder kids. Kids that are either running too high, too much beta, where they're hyperactive and they need to slow them down, or kids that are a little bit running too much theta and they're not able to focus their attention. Neurobiofeedback or brain biofeedback for children, they might use like a bouncing ball or a guy running in a race. And the idea is they've got an 8 or a 16 channel EEG, and the really cool ones now, I don't know whether you guys have these, are the ones with the mounted in the helmets. They look like a bicycle helmet. They're kind of cool, so kids like them. They put them on, and on a computer screen, they see what their brain is doing illustrated in some graphic form, and their objective is to get the ball to bounce at a certain height or get the guy to win the race. And what's really going on is they're learning how to get their brain into that zone, that ideal state for learning by this experiential deal. Now, it takes 20 to 30 sessions of about an hour apiece for most people. Most kids, and after that, they don't need the hardware anymore. They can kind of cast it aside because they've gotten the feedback, the bicycle effect, if you will, Nick's bicycle effect, and they're able to remember how to do that, and then at will get their brains into that ideal state for learning. Now, in Minneapolis, they did a charter school. This is now 5 or 6 years old. They did this charter school where they took all the kids that were on Ritalin, within certain perimeters, put them in this school. At the end of the first year, 80% of those kids were off of Ritalin and the psychoactive drugs, and were starting to be integrated back into regular education programs. That is a profound use of a technology that was at one time restricted strictly to the military. And here's an application. Now, when you think about it, any of you who know kids in this position, you can easily see what it does for them. Any of you that don't know any kids in this position, and all of you pay taxes ultimately to your school systems, either through the place you rent, property taxes, sales tax, whatever they have here. This is something that each of you can be a committee of one and do something in this community. You can contact the Minneapolis School District. You can ask them about their neurobiofeedback or their charter schools program. Get the information. There are 15,000 school districts in the United States, most of which are not using this yet. And here's the difference, is for a kid in that position in a regular program for education, for their full 12 years plus kindergarten, it might cost the taxpayer $4,000 to $10,000 a year more to educate each of those kids. If you can solve the problem in 1 year, put them in a regular education program, it's pretty clear what that means to everybody within communities. And one of the toughest recruiting positions within school districts, the toughest jobs to hire are special education teachers, people that address these needs on that level. And here's technology now 20 years old that's just now starting to make it into school districts. In Minnesota, they're starting to see more and more school districts pick it up. Wisconsin and neighboring states are starting to pick it up. But this is really leading edge technology. And you've got practitioners here that can do it. Insurance doesn't cover it because they call it experimental. You might find some progressive insurer. And it's usually fairly expensive. When you go to a private practice, it might cost you. I don't know what your sessions run, but in Alaska, they're running $100 to $150 a session. Well, most parents with kids are having enough trouble just getting things taken care of. But here is something that one appropriation of 1 year's school appropriation for that kid could solve it in 80% of the cases. And this is extremely important. The idea of balancing both hemispheres of the brain through, in this case, binaural beat is what Monroe uses. All the CDs in the back are based on binaural beat. They're all Monroe materials. The other reason I like Monroe is he doesn't use silent subliminals. Any of those that have actual words on them, you can hear it clearly. And why is this important? If I say the word dog in this room, half the people, or maybe more, will have warm, fuzzy feelings, and some people will be gripped with fear for other things that they've experienced in their lives, relative to a dog. So the dog is the symbol, the word symbol. So word symbols have profound effects that mean different things to different people. So when you're using subliminals, you want to know what those word symbols are to make sure they line up with your belief system and don't conflict with it, because that conflicting of belief system sets up things that will definitely damage you emotionally in the long run. So you want to hear what's on them. So I like HemiSync because the ones that do have voiceover, you can actually hear it. Most of them that I brought with me don't have voice. They're strictly tonal, that are designed to stimulate various portions of the brain to create specific effects. So some are set up for concentration, accelerated learning. Some are set up for different applications. Sleep, for instance, pretty useful for that, for people who have trouble with that. Creativity, those kinds of things. The other thing that you do when you combine that flickering light effect with binaural beat, how many have seen light and sound devices? They've been around quite a while now. Boy, these have been around since the 80s. And light and sound devices combined. This one is the Orion. I don't carry the Orion anymore. They've upgraded it to now a Sirius, which is what I carry. This has 23 preset programs to do 4 basic functions: accelerated learning, meditation, relaxation, and increasing your general energy level. Utilizing essentially brain entrainment and moving the brain into a very specific area. Let me just click this on. Can you see the lights flickering? Now, if you have any history of epilepsy, you cannot use these devices. Flickering light, your doctor will tell you, don't go near strobes or flickering lights. So otherwise, this thing adjusts so you can adjust brightness, but you put the goggles on, you close your eyes because the light goes through and it's easier to relax with your eyes closed. The light goes through the eyelids and creates that entrainment effect, and these pre-programmed programs essentially drive the brain into that ideal state that you're seeking, and those preset programs set them up. The other reason I like this device has dual inputs. So if I want to go into a learning program, they got an accelerated learning program on here, and then I want to take a lecture from one of my professors and plug it in. I can plug it in, listen to the lecture, while I'm getting the whole brain effect for anchoring that knowledge or remembering that knowledge for memory retention. So for accelerated learning, this one's a pretty good device. But then it has the headset that goes with it, so it's doing a binaural beat with the head. It's doing the lights to amplify it, so you're getting dual inputs from the auditory system and the visual system, and training the brain, getting in this ideal state, and then loading the information in. Very effective technology. This one is, how many have heard about kinesiology? Wow, yeah, I'm in the right neighborhood. Kinesiology is this idea where somebody takes something like maybe this bottle of water, and because it's in a plastic bottle, it'll be bad for someone, and so you hold it in one hand, and then the guy holds out his arm, and then somebody presses on it, and you feel the muscle tension. And then they say, well, it's good or it's bad based on that feedback. And you might like hold a pack of cigarettes or aluminum foil or something, or you might hold a nice, fresh, organic apple and see what the difference is. The problem with kinesiology is so much of it is subjective. Is he really pushing as hard, or is she really pushing as hard? Well, you can use what are called muscle tensiometers, which quantify that. A muscle tensiometer you can wrap around this part of the arm that actually measures the muscle strength digitally. So you get a digital readout or a numeric readout that's quantitative. You can quantify it. It's not subjective anymore. So those involved in kinesiology, go on the internet and do a search on muscle tensiometers and integrate those into your practice, and it will help those that really don't have a complete understanding of what that is. But why I bring it up is relaxation. We talked about stress and the things in the environment that create stress. And you can usually tell stress because you look around the room and you can see, this part of your head tenses up always, when you're stressed. So what this does, this has an auditory output signal. So you hear this signal. This is a muscle tensiometer. It fits into a headband. These are 3 little metal discs that fit right here on the forehead. And so what you're hearing in this is you hear a tone coming out of this headset, and that tone starts out real high. As you relax, it gets lower and lower and lower. So it's like a training tool for relaxation. This one, I don't yet carry it, but I like it because it's cheap and it's simple. It has less than the 3-button rule. This one's got 2 buttons, so it's real easy to use. It has 2 settings, one high, one low. So once you master being able to relax, you're using the device to get that feedback, so you're going, okay, this is what it feels like to relax, and you do it regularly, daily, for about a month. Then you go give this to a friend of yours because now you can do it at will. So midday when you're stressed, you can immediately go back into that state of relaxation while the alpha rhythms kick back in, where your focused attention goes back where it needs to be, and your learning ability kicks back in. Now there's much more sophisticated hardware than this, but this is like the low end of the biofeedback realm for average people. And you know, like light and sound devices, I do a workshop that goes about eight hours where we do a lot of hands-on. I bring about 4 or 5 of these, and most of them, the other ones I have you know, programmability and like 9 different perimeters, and you can do all this really cool stuff with them. And the only people that appeals to are researchers, because the average person is looking for usually one of those 4 basic functions, and they just want to be able to either relax and get to sleep, focus their attention for learning, or get their energy level boosted when they're at that low point during the day. And these devices work for that. The reason I demonstrate a little bit is this is all stuff that's been done, predominantly independently by independent researchers and scientists who've developed methods and protocols without access to any of the military material. The military's material, and this I was saying during the break, that the biggest crime isn't who we blow up, it's the information we withhold, and how many we could save if that information were more available to, particularly in the health practitioners and health fields. You know, this is where a lot of knowledge should be shared in order to enhance human performance rather than looking for the best way to degrade it. When you think about a technological society, you know, the idea that we use like 10% of our brain, the idea of being able to stimulate and perhaps finding ways to stimulate the anomalous functions of the brain, this is an area both of keen interest on the part of the military. You'll remember even Monroe. You know, Monroe started, how many know anything about Monroe in this room? God, you know, this is really the right group. You know, when Monroe started, it was he owned a bunch of radio stations and a company back in Virginia. And what happened is he had a spontaneous, what they call a OBE, an out-of-body experience, and as an engineer, you know, he noticed that there was this sort of background noise, hum, but it was a coherent signal. It was a rhythmic signal, and so it got his curiosity up, and he set up a lab within his facility to start experimenting to see if he could artificially stimulate this in others. And I think over 60,000 people have gone through the Monroe Institute and be able to replicate some of that in their own lives. Now, out of body, I don't know what that means. I mean, somebody asked me once if you had that experience, and the answer was yeah, but. And the but was, I had the sensation, but was I gone, or was I there, or was it something going on within the brain, within the mind that wasn't necessarily projecting me out of my body? You know, I think a lot of this stuff, we look at what's going on within our heads, and we try and give it some physical relationship, so we interpret what's going on in ways that make us comfortable, that fit our belief systems. And so a lot of that, I think, plays into this. What we do know, however, is that there are some very unusual possibilities when the brain is fully engaged. And I think this is where the excitement is for me, is, you know, the work in this area. Now we're getting tools developed that actually can enhance the average person's performance. That's when I start to get excited, because that starts to get things down on a level where we can use them. I like HemiSync because it's the least expensive mode for altering consciousness in a way that has been experimentally shown to be very successful. And in this, I think we've had those, 7 years now that we've been carrying HemiSync as a sideline because we like them, and I've never had one returned, you know, ever. And you know, and I find that remarkable, because most things, you know, people will try and maybe they like it, maybe they don't. But in this case, we've had pretty much universal acceptance. The only time it's not useful is if you have a particular hearing impairment, because then you can't get that binaural beat effect. So if you do have hearing impairments, depending on what frequencies are involved, they may not work for you. But again, the other things that we've demonstrated in other environments is electrocranial stimulation. This is the use of electromagnetic fields for creating the same effect. Again, within those frequency ranges, using a pulsed signal, very low amperage in the milliamp range, very, very low voltage, but perceptible. And in this case, you have two connections here and then behind the ear. And the problem is you got to use this goo to get everything to stick. And nobody likes the stuff. And you can get the same effect using light and sound without the frustration of gooing up your face and your hair. So I didn't bring that to demonstrate today, but it gives you get the general idea. You can utilize lots of different ways to affect what happens within the brain, and of course what happens within the brain affects the rest of the body as well. The biggest, I think the biggest handicap today is the fact that we're stressed as a population. I mean, we are under this constant stress when we're being asked to make more and more complex decisions in our personal and public lives that really require optimum thinking and optimum brain performance. And this is, again, why I think this is, for me, the most important issue for the next several years, is the idea of saying, okay, these are the things that are happening from a military perspective. These are the things that are happening, just starting to happen on the civilian side and being made available to people. Let's make sure that the technologies we develop in the 21st century are there to serve us rather than to just create the next group of slaves for political agendas. You know what Brzezinski said about all of the technology that was being evolved, and what he said is that the ability to use this kind of technology and misuse this technology would be so compelling that whether liberal or conservative, I'm paraphrasing, liberal or conservative, the temptation to use it to further political ends would override anybody's good sense to refrain. And I think that's true. If you think back to the first Bush election, not this one that just ran, but the one before, do you remember the ads that were run where they used Democrats and rats, and they put rats in as a subliminal, and it was a mistake, and they withdrew the ad real quickly? It was no mistake. When you take it on the edge, and most voters are on the edge until, they go into the little box and pull the lever. But think about the ability, if you're looking at a television screen, and do this when you go home tonight if you have a television, is turn the TV on and don't look at the screen, turn the lights off in the room and look at the wall behind you and look at the flicker rate of the light. And most of it's incoherent. It's just all over the map. But occasionally you'll see a very rhythmic patterns. Those are the ones to be careful of. Because if you're able to use that flickering light effect within a few moments of watching that commercial, whether it's the images changing at the right speed, whether it's the flicker just below where your eyes aren't really picking it up, but that flicker is happening, and the brain then trains into this highly suggestive state, and then you're being fed the ad. Now put that in a political context. This is unregulated because you're not using subliminals. You're just using the energy of the image itself, which is still debated in scientific circles as being capable of creating these kinds of effects. Yet you see them in the literature. Now there's, on light and sound devices, there's a flash points back there that's all the studies showing what happens to blood chemistry in terms of light and sound devices. Blood chemistry changes, there are huge changes that take place. These are all quantifiable, demonstratable, and the idea of this being integrated into media, and there's no restriction on this at this point. This is why these technologies have to get wider play and wider discussion, because the technology are advancing, it's becoming more and more common knowledge among professionals, and being able to utilize that knowledge in a way that can be destructive is out there, or that can be self-motivated. I've had people in lectures like this stand up and say, but wouldn't it be great if we could make everybody happy? And the answer is no. Human beings are meant to experience the full range of emotions. That's what makes us who we are. If you think about it, everyone in the room with a little bit of gray hair, and even those without, will tell you that the best experience they had were not those warm and fuzzy moments. They were the worst things in life that taught us the absolute most in life, that actually benefited us to the greatest degree and carried us through however many years we've managed to make it. And if you really think about those kinds of learning experiences, they require a lot of hard, negative emotions from time to time, and that's just part of the human character. Any idea of changing that, the idea of interfering with what goes on in the brain without consent, everyone uniformly that I've ever presented to finds that highly objectionable. Most religious traditions tell us that even God won't interfere with free will. And yet here you've got technologies that can do exactly that. And in my estimation, that is the essence of what is evil in the world. Persuasion is much different. When you think about, there's a book called Man the Manipulator, and I think it's been out of print for probably a couple decades, but you can find it if you look for it. And it contrasts persuasion versus manipulation. And persuasion is this concept that you deliver all the information, you engage the debate, and the debate falls out, wherever it's going to fall out. Manipulation is where you give just enough information to compel someone to do what you want, right? That's not healthy debate. That's the kind of debate that we have today. It's the way, how do you first get everyone emotionally charged enough so they separate from each other, fractionalize any constituency base, get them to fight over the small issues, and really when the really tough decisions come down, you're so emotionally charged you can't make good decisions. Look at an EEG, you know, what's going on in the brain when you're under any of the negative emotions, and you're going to see brain patterns all over the map. Look at that same EEG when you're experiencing positive emotions, love, consideration, joy, and you see very coherent wave patterns where the brain can make good decisions. You know, in fear and environments of fear, if you make a good decision, it's on the flight or fight response. It's by chance more than by directed intellectual control. When you look, if you take two people and they're in love with each other and they gaze in each other's eyes. Remember, I looked into her eyes, right? You know that? Well, do it. And what will happen is if you monitored both brains and they were gazing in each other's eyes, both brains will begin to harmonize in that alpha range, which is real interesting. When you think about that whole concept, you know, of people getting together and coming together and that you're more than the sum of the total in the room, you know, you add in resonance. The idea that people working together can create really powerful and incredible things, I think is real true. And on a fundamental level, it is very, very true. So energetically, I think what we do in our societies is first we dampen everything because of the swamp we live in. So our performance becomes more important. Everybody's doing things to try and mitigate that, supplements, everything. You know, I mean, think about all the things people do to improve their health and reduce their stress. And I think that's the key for the future is going to be reducing our stress levels, increasing our intellectual capacity, and our heart capacity for recognizing that in all of this, we're not separate human beings. We are part of the greatest of all the human race, the political party that we all belong to, and the one that deserves the attention that it hasn't been getting through the right use of technologies and not their misuse. And with that, I'll conclude and take some questions. Fair enough? All right. So did we go about 2 hours? All right. So what I've got, I'm going to go through these little cards that I've got. Some of them are the same, and then we'll just see what we've got. Okay, the first one, which always comes up, and several people ask this, what about electronic harassment and the idea of victims? And I want to talk a little bit about that. I mentioned Secretary of Energy O'Leary's claim of 500,000 people victimized by human experiments. I think there are victims. The problem is sorting it out. And it's almost impossible to sort it out because the way in which a signal can be carried in are numerous. As a consequence, you know, what can we do? Because there's so many different ways that a signal can be carried in, I don't believe there's anything the average person can do to block this type of technology. If it were, say, a microwave, there's things you can do to dissipate a microwave. If it was a signal on another carrier, like a radio signal or a TV signal, then you're talking about something you got to embed in the TV, you know, to screen that out, sort it out. And you got to have enough knowledge to do that. The real answer is a political answer, and it's the steps we've taken in Europe and gotten this issue moved forward, the things that are happening in the Russian Duma are moving it forward, other governments in Europe are taking this issue on. Eventually, this government will as well. But first, the first step is getting it in the common knowledge. Now, I get, and Sheila will tell you, probably 3 or 4 inquiries a week from people that assert that they're victims by this type of technology. Out of those, it's very difficult to sort out who is truly a victim and who may indeed have other problems. It's very difficult to sort out. Now, there's some patterns that emerge, you know, because we've gotten now really thousands of these, and we've kept them, and there are certain patterns that emerge, but it's very difficult to sort out. But I would say that, you know, there probably are some victims there. Here's what we have said to all of those folks. Focus on concentrate on the technology itself. The first step is to educate folks on technology and what it does. It's the old laser analogy I gave earlier about the burn through the chest, and everyone today would say a laser, and 50 years ago would say you're crazy. The first issue is get people educated on the technology, they know the technology exists, then you might be able to make that next leap, that there are actually victims of this technology. So what I've said to victims, and any of those that are in this audience, I say it again, is spend your time researching the data. You know, I'm one guy in Alaska. You know, I research a lot, but things have been sent to me from all over the country where obscure research papers that are peer-reviewed, or articles in journals, or company records where publicly traded companies invented something new. People send me things all the time. Spend your time documenting the technology and getting it to people that can make that a public issue, so that eventually we can eventually address the victims themselves. The next question I had here is one on, could you talk about the Taos hum? And the question is this HAARP, and how can you shield against it? How many have not heard about the Taos hum? Okay, there's a few. Taos hum is a signal that was first got notoriety in Taos, New Mexico, where people kept hearing this buzzing sound, or this woodpecker kind of sound, or in some cases like a low dieseling sound of an engine rumbling. And they picked up this sound, and everyone around them, nobody could hear it. Well, there was a congressman from New Mexico that actually, the University of New Mexico and a couple of the government labs did a study to see whether there was really a sound that was being perceived by some and not by others. And they determined that 1% to 3% of the population perceives these kinds of signals, which is interesting, although they said they couldn't determine where they were coming from, which you send a government lab in to find out where a coherent signal comes from that can't be explained, chances are it's them. Because it's a coherent signal, it's not something that nature would produce, number one. The other thing that comes out is these are not isolated to Taos, New Mexico. There's over 500 cases a year reported in Great Britain alone. If you go back to the invention of radio over 100 years ago, there was a small segment of the population when radio broadcasts first started playing that said, hey, it's driving me crazy. And everyone discounted them because it was a small percentage of the population. You are crazy, you know, and they let it go. But the fact is, Taos hum has been quantified. I have an article on my website at earthpulse.com called Sourcing the Taos Hum, and my brother Tom, I had write it based on the research we've done, and there's a number of footnotes, so you can go there and get some more information on that as well. The next question was, what's the main source of your information? Freedom of Information Act was the question, and the answer is, it's not the Freedom of Information Act. That's probably the least used for me. Most of this is in the open literature. I'll tell you kind of how we approach it. Like with HAARP, when we took on the HAARP issue, we looked at the material within the military record and the people that were involved. Then we looked at the people that were involved. What institutions were they associated with? What else had they published professionally? Who else did they work with in teams in terms of scientific research, and what were they involved in? Then what companies were they involved with? What do those shareholder reports say about their newest innovations and their newest contract wins? Sometimes we'll go to the military procurement sites that do the request for proposals, the RFPs, where they talk about what they want. We want to be able to do X. Well, they don't just generate those out of the blue. Some company comes in and says, hey, you got to see this new gadget I've got. They write an RFP because they got to have a public open process. They put it out for bid. Everybody who has something similar comes in. Then you look at who wins those RFPs, and then you go backwards. You find out who won them. You look at their stock reports. You look at what technologies they developed, who was involved in those technologies, what professional papers they published, and then you start unraveling it, and that's what we do. The military calls us accumulators now. It used to be called investigative reporting. And it's true. I mean, they've demonized people that use the public record to come to conclusions based upon what's out there, and a certain amount of material does get into the open literature, and you can find it. You just have to dig. Libraries are still really good things. You know, the internet is not the only answer. In fact, when we started our work, we avoided the internet because we didn't consider it reliable, and it wasn't very reliable. You know, back in the 90s, there's a lot of misinformation or out of context information that we would run into. So we always wanted hard copies. So it's not FOIAs, it's library work and good hard digging. The next question was, is HAARP being monitored? The answer is there is no independent monitoring that I'm aware of on a consistent basis on HAARP. That's one of the things we've asked for years. Hopefully one day we see that. And then the other question was on the same card was, can phones be utilized for mind control purposes? The answer is yes. You heard it from Smirnov. Any of these systems can be utilized. Any of these systems that can carry a signal in, can get reasonably close to the head or proximity to the body, can do this. And then the next one was EMF, are the current EMF shields effective? You know, a lot of them aren't. A lot of them don't work. You know, there was a number of devices on cell phones that were put out. The Federal Trade Commission shut down, I think, 7 or 8 companies because they made claims that couldn't be substantiated. We look for substantiation in the form of either granted United States patents, which meant you had to do your due diligence and convince a patent examiner that you had something new and that it worked, you know, that it was innovative and it worked. And independent studies. And so when you're looking at people that are asserting that they have something that will protect from EMFs, electromagnetic fields, ask for the independent research that supports it and take a good look at it. If they can't produce that, I wouldn't waste your time or your money, because you ought to be able to substantiate that. Can hurricanes be deflected by high energy technology? I think the answer on that is yes, and I'll tell you where it comes from. It's the Wall Street Journal, and it was 1997, and let me get you the site. Sorry, this one I don't remember. Wall Street Journal, Malaysia to battle smog with cyclones, November 13th, 1997. This article was a Russian offer. Remember when the Indonesian fires were burning and blowing smoke into Southeast Asia? The Russians offered to create a cyclone or hurricane to blow the smoke out of the neighborhood. They think they can do it. There's a documentary called Owning the Weather on Discovery or the Science Channel. I'm in it, although I'd never seen it. I don't even remember when I was interviewed for it. But it's on weather modification. It's a pretty good one. So watch it. It cycles about every 3 or 4 months. I think it ran about a month ago, but it has quite a bit on that. Ben Eastland, who is the inventor of the HAARP array, Ben Eastland formed Arco Power Technologies. He's a physicist. He goes back to the 1950s. He was contracted by the European Space Agency to look at HAARP as a way to mitigate the energy in tornadoes. Now, tornadoes, when they form, it's essentially a cold and a warm front come together and they create a shearing action which causes the twisting and the tornadoes form. And Ben's idea was if you took HAARP and you could heat up that cold front sufficiently that it would take the energy out when the two fronts collided. You wouldn't have the necessary ingredients to create that shearing action in that tornado. Well, that was peer-reviewed and presented in Europe and accepted as a peer-reviewed paper. And then FEMA thought it was kind of interesting, and NASA, and so they contracted with him to look at the same thing utilizing laser-based, satellite-based lasers to accomplish the same thing. What Ben points out is this one sort of issue is if you miscalculate and you end up heating the warm area instead of the cold area, and you increase the energy differentials, that you might, change it from, the Category 3 to the Category 5 tornado. I think they classify them in the same kind of range. The point is, yes, you can have these effects. The question is, what are the downstream effects? And these cannot be fully modeled. We are not capable of modeling the entire global system and understanding it, which is why there's still science being practiced on the planet. We're still trying to figure it all out. But what we do know is very small inputs can create huge unanticipated outputs. It's the butterfly effect in physics. You cannot properly model, which even though the treaties allow you to experiment like on weather modification within your own country, nature didn't draw those boundaries, we did. Nature follows a different set of rules, and consequently the idea of even experimenting in weather modification within the boundaries of your country is ridiculous because it's going to affect someone else elsewhere. If you use this technology, as has been suggested, to solve one problem and you create a problem for someone else. So let's say they're having a drought in Mexico and the Mexican government decides they're going to use weather modification, and we say, hey, don't do that, you might screw up our weather. And they do. They move their drought, say, to central part of the United States and wipe out our wheat crop one year. Would we consider that an act of war? I think so. I think any other country would too. So when we're experimenting, or anyone else is, we really need to ask the question is, should we be doing this? Just because we can doesn't necessarily mean that we should. Let's see what else I've got here. Somebody asked if there's ways to measure the signals coming from, I'm assuming this is related to HAARP, but yeah, you can do that. You can measure it. It says, can you do it directionally? Do you remember the woodpecker event back in the 70s where ham radio operators were complaining that they kept getting this signal that was interfering with their radio broadcasts? And what they did is they all started working together and they triangulated and figured out where they were coming from. And so they were able to locate those original transmitters in the former Soviet Union. There were 5 of them. And that's what they determined was, yeah, you can find them. You can locate them if you've got equipment. Even ham operators could do it if you know what you're looking for and you've got the right hardware. Somebody asked about nanotechnology, but it's off topic, so I'm not going to go there. Those are things built on a billionth scale. The only thing I can say is that when you talk about implant technologies, things are getting scaled down pretty dramatically. There's a new medical implant that's used for medical diagnoses that was in Technology Review, which is MIT's journal. And it was several years ago, like 3 or 4 years ago now, but it is the size of the first number on the date of a dime. So it is extremely small. As you get smaller and smaller and more powerful technologies, then you start to think about things in much different terms. Like when we talked about implants for locating people, for GPS applications, for locating military personnel. Now this is, that's 1989 technology. Now implant technologies could monitor heart rate, stress levels, all kinds of vital functions of a person in such a way as to really look at the battlefield, not just where all your hardware is, but all your troops are and what condition they're in. So there's a lot more, and as these things get smaller and smaller and more powerful, the prediction is what you have on your desktop will get down to the size of a grain of sand in terms of power and computing power. Or conversely, what you have on your desktop today will be 1,000,000 times more powerful. That's, like a supercomputer on every desk. Now that's where we're headed. So nanotechnology certainly plays a part in that, along with a lot of other areas, including health and a number of others. The question of who owns the Lay Foundation in Dallas. The Lay Foundation was created by one of the heirs of Herman Lay. Herman Lay founded Lay Potato Chips. He merged it with Frito-Lay and then merged it with PepsiCo and was their chairman of the board up until his death in the 80s. One of his daughters has followed my work for about 9 years. She contacted me years ago and asked for some help on something. We helped her with that. She then contacted me about 2 years ago and said, look, I really like what you're doing. I want to set up a foundation that allows us to really help get this issue out there. And she said, would you be on my board? And I said, well, who's on your board? And I got the list of people on the board. And there's one individual that I just didn't feel right about. I said, no, I can't be on your board. I'm just not making associations when I don't feel totally comfortable, and I don't feel comfortable on this. And she asked me why, and I said, just do your due diligence. You'll figure it out. She did. A few months later, she threw the person off the board and reconfigured it. And then the next thing we did is I went down for 3 days to spend 3 days with her, because my rule is, and Sheila's and my rule is, if we don't like the person, basically, we won't work with them. Because I figure there's billions of people in the world, and I haven't met all the ones I like yet. It's tough enough to do that. And I trust my instincts, because I've been burned before in making bad associations. And we spent 3 days to find out what the motivations behind her interest in technologies were and why she was willing to commit some resources to this. And from my perspective, she did a really great thing. She put the kind of dollars necessary to keep me in this work at a time and at a juncture where I was about to go do something different, totally different, because it was just too difficult. I mean, I've made and spent $2.5 million in the last 11 years, to the point of our personal bankruptcies 2 years ago, to get these issues out. And 2 years ago, we said, look, if we're not going to get the help that we need, then we're done. We'll move on into other areas. And I had plenty of offers from health institutions in Alaska and others. And we said, okay, well, if we're going to do this work, then something has to happen to change it. And I'm going through my files. My colleague, Jim Roderick, who was my co-author for years, passed away a few years ago. And I find this file, and it says on the header, Lay. And I remembered the inquiry from years before. And I thought, boy, this is just the kind of person that could really help right now. Put the file back in the drawer, and 4 days later, the phone rang, and it was her assistant asking if we'd be participant in this board. And so, it hit me in the head a couple times, I figured out. And it just seemed like the right thing, and as we developed the relationship, it was the right thing, and it has allowed us to really continue to do the kind of work that we're doing. They are funding 2 very important projects for us. One is the book on this topic of mind control, which we should have out later in the year, which has all the references and sources so people can really start to take this on. The other thing that the Lay Foundation funded for us is the establishment of a website where all of our data, all of the abstracts that we've done on the clippings that we've clipped over the years are going to be there. So you'll have a bibliographical reference to all the technology areas, which include everything from climate change to mind control that we've captured. So you'll have a full bibliographical index, and then the abstracts, what we've sort of summarized that are a 50-word or less quotes, so you get the sense of it. So you can do word searches. So if you want to go radio frequency, all the articles that have to do with that will pop up. And then you can go dig those articles out on your own and begin to utilize the information more effectively for other researchers. So that'll come up probably late this year, early next year, and be available to everybody universally for free. So people can start to use the data and then feed data back to us that we can then continue to add in and post. So that's the Lay Foundation and how we got involved with them. And then it says, what is the power input for HAARP and where does power come from? Right now, they're plugged into the energy grid in Alaska. They're using effective radiated power. Look it up because that's the important thing that we're talking about here when we talk about 1 billion watts. Ultimately, what they want is gas-driven hydrodynamic generators, essentially converting natural gas, into electricity, which then can be used for generating the radio frequency energy that they're using on these arrays. That was really the beginning of it. When you go back to HAARP, ARCO, which at that time owned trillions of cubic feet of natural gas on the North Slope, wanted a market for it. There is no pipeline for our natural gas. That's a big debate right now in the Congress and around. But they figured, Eastland said, well, look, we can burn the gas right here. We can use these generators that are very efficient and lightweight, and then we can just use it for missile defense applications, which is where this really began. He felt that you could inject enough energy into the magnetic lines of force that surround the planet, which would act like waveguides, so that when you think about that energy coming around the planet, starting at the South Pole and coming up, remember the old bar magnet in school where all the little metal fragments, you see the lines of magnetic energy. The idea is they move south to north, but if you punch energy in, inject energy in, and utilizing the cyclotron resonance, they act as a waveguide. The energy sort of wraps around that magnetic line of force and then moves from north to south, and then any object with sophisticated electronics passing through those energy fields becomes disrupted and crashes. So as a missile shield, this is where Bernard Eastland started, and it required an array 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers square, a huge array, and incredible amounts of natural gas. And the North Slope was the ideal place because you want to be close to where the magnetic lines intersect the planet, which is at the poles. So you have to push less energy in to reach the target, which is the magnetic lines of force for that particular application. So big gas supplies, you're in the United States territorially, so you can protect it. And you have this incredible system of being able to literally manipulate the dynamo of the planet for a weapons application. That's where it started. Let's see what else we got here. Somebody asked, was Katrina directed? Some have said yes. I don't think so. And I say that in this sense, is to get me to say, yeah, that was directed, you're going to have to produce some paper that's compelling and convincing. I don't want to hear about somebody's conversation with the clandestine guy in the phone booth. I don't care about that. And anything that you see in our references, I think out of 1,350 references, you'll see 2 conversations quoted, and we have the tapes to back up the conversations. So you can hear them, and the people are who they are, and their credentials are well known. But otherwise, it's hard paper for us. And that's what's allowed us to take these kinds of issues credibly into any venue that we've gone into, been challenged respectfully and reasonably, but it's the documents that carry the day. It's not my opinion, not my theories, not my projections, but it's their own words. All we've done is accumulate them, as they say, being the accumulator, and get them out. And that's it. And I think that's, the freedom of the press, people think of freedom of the press today as it's say what you want, whenever you want, however you want. That is not what freedom of the press was originally about. It was about the idea that a free press was required in order to have an informed electorate which could make the decisions. So the common person could make decisions. So if you look back, the late 1700s and early 1800s, every major city in the country had several newspapers, and they were what they called rags. They were like 1 page, 2 page, mostly editorial. But what isn't editorial? You know, really. I mean, the assignment editor decides who's going to write the story. Everybody's got their bias, how they ask a question, when they ask a question, or if they ever ask a question. You know, all that plays in. Well, in the old days, bias was accepted. And then you had these lively debates because you had one paper saying one thing, one saying the opposite, and the people would meet wherever people met in those days, in the pub or in the square, and have a debate and an argument and get somewhere. Today we've got the neutered news. You know, there's nothing left in it. So there isn't a big fiery debate. There's no debate at all. In fact, a lot of what you see coming out of the press today on the military are just regurgitation of a press release without any investigation at all. That's the validity of what's being said. So I'm kind of the opinion that we have an opinion, we state it loudly. I have a bias, it's right here, you know, but that bias is based on a foundation of facts that I'm willing to debate anybody on. And if I'm wrong, you know, okay, the first lesson is when you're wrong is stand up, say you're wrong, and make the corrections. But in all of the years we've done this, that has not happened. And the invitations of challenge that have been laid down by others besides us have never been met. They will not come to the forums, they will not have the debate. And we've always been prepared to bring in the specialists, the scientists, to have that debate in any of the areas that they want to have the argument in. Let me just read a couple more of these, and then we'll call it good. The one question: is there positive counter technologies? And you know, we are that counter technology as human beings. And I say it again: it's up to us. You know what's required? As a young person, I used to be all wrapped up in this idea. You know, what is faith about? You know, faith, and I thought it was some big complicated thing. It's simple. It's knowing something in your head and acting on it. Knowing what is right and true and doing something about it. It doesn't mean that you always win. In fact, a lot of times you don't. But what is winning after all but trying? The effort is what is important. You know, people say, well, everyone's so apathetic. Hurrah. You know, if only 8% of the people vote, you got to convince 4.1% that you're right and get them to the polls. It's a lot easier than 50%. You know, so I had this debate in Australia where they made voting mandatory. You got to vote there if you're of age. You got to vote. And they thought, what a great thing, what a great thing. You know how hard it is now to engage the political process in that country unless you've got command of the media, which means you better have an awful lot of money. They basically made it so impossible because the average person doesn't engage. Now they have to engage, so they do, but what are they pulling the lever based on? Informed knowledge or just based on the latest emotional spin they got off the last ad on the way to the poll? Apathy is not necessarily your adversary. It can be your friend, especially when you're on this, trying to bring in new ideas and new issues. And the only requirement is effort. And if each of us makes some small effort, something everyone in this room can do, when you go home tonight, think of the issue that is the most important to you. It doesn't have to be any of the stuff we've covered today. Write it down and write 10 things you can do or 5 things you can do that take 10 minutes. You know, letter to the editor, conversation with a friend, letter to a congressman, whatever. Throw it in with your bills, right? That miserable time of month when you got to go through the bills and pay them. After you've done that, then pay your dues to the rest of the human race and spend 10 minutes doing something proactive about what you care about. Recognize you're connected to the most powerful thing on the planet. It's called the organic internet, the human race. And that's where change happens. That's where it begins. And every one of us in this room is a committee of one and can do 10 times what I've done or anyone like me has done if we engage the effort. At the same time, having said that is, do what is directly in front of you. Too many times I've seen folks get engaged in an issue and go to the finish line before they run the race. And they end up collapsing their economies or incapable of managing their affairs and getting on with the work that needs to be done. Do what's within your sphere of influence. That sphere widens as you gain experience and do the next thing. You should not have anxiety when you're engaged. You should have that knowledge of doing the right thing with confidence, not with fear. Each step along the way builds that confidence. At the end of the road, we all win the race. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much. And we'll hang around, so if you got questions and all the stuff in the back, we'll be happy to answer questions on any of that.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax deductible. This recording is not copyrighted and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.